Step back with us tonight to medieval Bruges, when the Zwin still carried salt water to the cloth halls. In the autumn of 1299, a Lübeck merchant named Hinrich Wittenborg ties his cog at the quay of Bruges, where the Zwin estuary reportedly still ran deep enough to float a ship of 200 tons. He has come to buy Flemish broadcloth for the warehouses of Novgorod and to pay his compulsory dues at the German Kontor on the Wallstraat. The city holds 40,000 souls, and the bells of a church mark the hours that regulate trade between the Baltic and the North Sea. You are standing at the corner of the Wallstraat and the Genthof as the first grey light begins to separate the belfry from the low clouds overhead. The cold damp of autumn fog rises from the canal water at first light, wrapping around your ankles and climbing the hem of your cloak. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in near silence, speaking only in the low murmur of those who have not yet shaken sleep from their throats. The Riedin, those canals named for the fully canalized stream Rii that once ran through Bruges, may carry the sound of early bells from the Church of Our Lady if one stands nearby. You can hear the water lapping against the stone embankments where a Flemish weaver's cart has just arrived at the cloth hall with finished broadcloth from a village workshop. The broadcloth is still warm from the fuller's hands, and the smell of fuller's earth and stale urine from the textile processing drifts across the quay in thin, intermittent waves. By 1300, Bruges had become one of the principal centers of textile industry and long-distance trade in Europe, and by the late 1290s, you can see the weight of that future pressing upon the present. The cart driver, a man named Jan van der Weyde, wraps his reins around the post and stretches his shoulders beneath a coat of undyed wool. His workshop lies 12 miles northeast, in the village of Dam, where the cloth industry employed thousands of weavers, fullers, and dyers in the surrounding countryside. He has been traveling since 2 hours before dawn, following the raised track beside the canal, steering his horse by memory when the fog thickened. Now he waits for the clerks of the cloth hall to arrive with their ledgers and their seals, the hollow clop of his wooden clogs on cobblestones having announced his presence to the empty street. You walk with him as far as the entrance to the hall, a vaulted passage where torches still burn in iron brackets, though the sky has begun to pale. The taste of salt on the wind from the Zwin, mixed with the sweetness of malted grain from inland breweries, touches your tongue as you turn toward the market square. The Zwin estuary connected Bruges to the sea, enabling maritime trade that drew ships from multiple nations. Already this morning, you can smell the tar of northern cogs and the spice of southern galleys mingling in the harbour air. The region around Bruges was a birthplace of early capitalism, and the instruments of that birth are visible everywhere. In the standardized weights hanging outside the weigh house, in the stacks of sealed contracts awaiting the next tide, in the very cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of cartwheels bearing cloth toward the sea. Italian bankers and merchants, especially from Florence and Genoa, were already established in Bruges before the German Hanseatic merchants, and as you pass the Lombard Street, you see their evidence. 3 men in the dark robes of the Bardi or Peruzzi banks stand in the shadow of the belfry, negotiating bills of exchange with the quiet intensity of those who move fortunes without moving a single coin. Their Italian is rapid and low, punctuated by the distant ring of iron on stone from the belfry carillon, marking the 3rd hour. One of them, a Florentine named Giovanni di Bernardo, has lived in Bruges for 11 years. He knows the Rhine better than he knows the Arno now, knows which canal leads to which warehouse, which bridge offers the driest crossing in flood season. He has watched the city grow from a prosperous town to something larger, something that draws the eyes of princes. His father, Robert the Liberal, understood the value of the Flemish cloth trade well enough to protect it, and the sun seems likely to follow that policy. You see the Duke's arms carved above a warehouse door as you continue your walk. The Lion of Flanders quartered with the Burgundian lozenges, painted fresh this past summer and already beginning to flake where the salt air reaches. By 1300, Bruges had approximately 40,000 inhabitants, a number that would have seemed unimaginable to the founders who built the first earthworks along the Rie. Those inhabitants are stirring now, the city passing from the hands of night workers to day workers with the gradualness of a tide turning. A woman emerges from a doorway with a bucket of slops for the canal, pausing to let you pass. A dog, thin and purposeful, trots across your path with something in its mouth that might once have been leather. The hollow clop of wooden clogs on cobblestones has multiplied now, become a scattered rhythm from a dozen streets at once. You find yourself walking toward the harbour, drawn by the increasing brightness where the fog begins to thin over the water. The Rhine widen here, approaching their junction with the Zwin, and the smell of fuller's earth and stale urine from the textile processing gives way to stronger, stranger scents. The pitch of hull caulking, the ammonia of dried fish, the particular mustiness of wool that has spent weeks below deck. The cold damp of autumn fog still clings to everything, but you can feel, somewhere beyond the grey, the promise of sun. A ship is being loaded at the nearest quay, a cog of the type that has become standard for the North Sea trade in this generation. Its master, Heinrich Wittenborg, stands at the rail with a tablet of wax, checking items against his manifest. His ship has come from the Baltic with timber and amber and will return with Flemish cloth if he can secure a cargo at the right price. Heinrich Wittenborg's cog may one day pass the battlefield debris of sloughs, said to be visible in the Zwin mudflats, though that passage would lie 4 decades in the future, in a June not yet arrived. You are seeing him now in the innocence of 1299, before the Battle of Sloughs occurred on June 24, 1340, in the roadstead near Sloughs during the 100 Years' War. The English king, Edward III, planned to land an invasion army in Flanders to support Flemish allies, and the English victory at Sloughs broke French dominance in the English Channel. But all of that is history unwritten, as Heinrich Wittenborg scratches his tally in the autumn fog. French Admiral Hugues Quiret died at the Battle of Sluys, likely born around 1290, a child of 10 in this moment, perhaps learning his first letters in some Ile-de-France cloister. The debris that Heinrich Wittenborg will one day pass, splintered oars, rusted mail, the bones of men who drowned in their armour, lies still in the unimagined future, waiting for the quarrels of kings to create it. The Zwin estuary connected Bruges to the sea, making maritime trade possible, and that same connection would make it a battlefield, a highway for invasion, a choke point that princes would fight to control. You turn from Heinrich Wittenborg's cog and walk back into the city, away from the harbour's edge where the fog is beginning to lift in ragged strips. The distant ring of iron on stone from the Belfry Carillon has ceased now, the mechanism run down until the sacristan returns to wind it for the Angelus. The first German merchants are seen walking the Wallstraat, counting houses not yet built, though in this year of 1299 they are still few, still tentative, still regarded with the suspicion that established traders always direct toward newcomers. You pass a group of them near the Carmelite convent, young men in the plain dress of Hamburg or Bremen, speaking low German in the loud, defensive tones of those who have not yet learned to make themselves understood in a foreign tongue. They are looking for the warehouse of a compatriot who arrived 2 years before, who wrote to them of opportunity, of cloth, of the strange Flemish system by which a weaver might work for wages rather than produce for himself. You follow them for a time, observing their hesitation at each intersection, their consultations of a scrap of parchment that seems to offer more confusion than guidance. The medieval city centre was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2000, though none of the stones they pass will know that honour, none of the timber frames will feel the plaque affixed to their descendants. Bruges was largely spared the widespread destruction that devastated many other European cities, so the streets these Germans wander are substantially the streets you might walk today, with much the same proportions, turns, and vistas of stepped gables and crow-stepped ends. The preservation is unimaginable to them, as unimaginable as the World Heritage Committee, as unimaginable as the very concept of heritage itself. The cold damp of autumn fog has begun to dissipate, though in the narrower streets the grey still pools like water in a cup. You leave the Germans to their searching and turn toward the Grote Markt, where the day's serious commerce will soon begin. The Cloth Hall dominates the eastern side of the square, its belfry rising above the city as it has since the middle of the last century. The distant ring of iron on stone from the belfry carillon still echoing in your memory, though the sound itself has faded. A Flemish weaver's cart arrives at the Cloth Hall with finished broadcloth from a village workshop, joining Jan van der Weide's load from Dam, and the square begins to fill with similar arrivals. Carts from Aardenburg, from Sluis itself, from the villages along the Zwin where the soil is too poor for grain, but supports the pasturage of the sheep whose wool becomes this cloth. The cloth industry employed thousands of weavers, fullers, and dyers in the surrounding countryside, and each cart represents a chain of labour that stretches backward through months and miles. The shearers in their barns, the sorters by winter firelight, the spinners in their cottages, the weavers at their looms, the fullers treading their vats with feet that never seem to lose the stain of the fuller's earth. The smell of fuller's earth and stale urine from the textile processing is stronger here, almost solid, a presence that seems to have weight and texture. You stand at the edge of the square and watch the clerks emerge from the Cloth Hall with their seals and their standards, watched in turn by the Italian bankers who have followed their bills of exchange from the Lombard Street to their destination. Italian merchants negotiate bills of exchange in the shadow of the belfry, their presence suggesting that Bruges may already be a node in a network that spans the continent. Giovanni di Bernardo is among them, his 11 years of residence giving him a familiarity that approaches belonging. He greets a clerk by name, exchanges a few words in Flemish that are fluent if accented, and turns to observe the arriving carts with the calculating patience of a man who has learned that wealth accumulates most surely to those who can wait. The hollow clop of wooden clogs on cobblestones has given way now to the fuller sound of a city entering its day, the rhythm more complex, less solitary. You feel the sun at last, a pale disk visible through the last rags of fog above the belfry, and the stones beneath your feet begin to lose their chill. The Dukes of Burgundy resided in Bruges at times, making it one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, and that wealth is visible in the very fabric of this square, in the carved facades, in the quality of the paving, in the confidence with which the citizens move through their mourning. They do not know, cannot know, that their city will outlast the duchy that shelters it, that Bruges will persist when Burgundy has become a name in history books, a colour, a wine. You walk northward now, toward the quarter where the harbour activities merge with the life of the city, where the warehouses of the Italian houses stand shoulder to shoulder with those of the Flemish merchants and the handful of Germans who have preceded the larger migration to come. Heinrich Wittenborg's cog will pass the battlefield debris of Sluis, still visible in the Zwin mudflats, and you find yourself returning to that future image, the cog of 1340 making its careful way through waters that still carry the memory of battle. The English victory at Sluis broke French dominance in the English Channel, but at what cost, you wonder, to the merchants who depended on that channel for their livelihood, to the weavers whose cloth could not move, to the city whose prosperity rested on the freedom of the sea. French Admiral Hugues Quiret died at the Battle of Sluys, a man of 50 in that fatal June, his life spanning the same decades that saw Bruges rise to its greatest height. The battle was one of 2 naval battles personally commanded by Edward III, a king who understood that control of the sea was control of the coast, control of the coast, control of the trade, control of the trade, control of the wealth that made power possible. But that is all to come. In this October of 1299, the Zwin is peaceful. The fishing boats are spreading their nets, and Heinrich Wittenborg is still a young man checking his manifest in the fog. You watch him from the quay, this German from Lübeck who will live to see the battle and survive it, who will grow old in a world changed by English longbows and French defeats. The cold damp of autumn fog has lifted entirely now, and the sun, though weak, throws actual shadows across the quay. You feel the warmth on your face, a sensation that seems almost intimate after the hours of grey. Around you, the city has achieved its morning rhythm, the near silence of dawn replaced by the purposeful noise of commerce. By 1300, Bruges had approximately 40,000 inhabitants, and on this morning, you can believe that every one of them is in motion somewhere, contributing to the pulse that you feel through the soles of your feet. Bruges was never destroyed by wars or large-scale fires, preserving its medieval character, and that preservation begins with this moment, with the solidity of these buildings, with the care of these citizens who have built for permanence in an age of flux. You find a stone bench at the quay's edge and sit for a time, letting the morning move around you. The hollow clop of wooden clogs on cobblestones is a memory too, replaced by the fuller orchestration of the waking city, but it persists in your inner ear, the signature sound of a moment that has passed. You close your eyes for a moment, and the sounds become more distinct. The water, the gulls, the distant hammering, the voices in languages you cannot identify. You open your eyes to find that the sun has climbed higher, the shadows shortened, the fog entirely gone. The Rhine shine now with a pale autumn light, the water reflecting the stepped gables and the occasional cloud with equal clarity. You rise from your bench and begin to walk again, without destination now, simply following the canals as they wind through the city. The Rhine lead you past warehouses and workshops, past churches and inns, past the houses of the great and the hovels of the poor. The cold damp of autumn fog is only a memory now, but the day has not warmed significantly, and your cloak still feels necessary, still feels like protection against something more than mere temperature. You pass a group of children playing at the edge of a smaller canal, their game involving the launching of leaf boats and the racing to see whose will reach the grate first. Their voices are high and unguarded, the sound of a childhood that is possible here, in this city, at this moment, before the battles and the plagues and the slow silting of the Zwin that will one day end Bruges's maritime dominance. The men working here are ankle-deep in their vats, their movements mechanical, their eyes fixed on some middle distance that is not this place. You watch them for a time, feeling the rhythm of their labor enter your own breathing, your own heartbeat. The hollow clop of wooden clogs on cobblestones is long past, but in this quarter you can hear something similar, the rhythmic splash of wooden soles in the vats, the same sound translated into a different labor. You move on, leaving the fullers to their work, and find yourself at length near the city wall, where the fortifications face outward toward the flat Flemish countryside. By 1300, Bruges had approximately 40,000 inhabitants, and some portion of them must be hearing this bell, must be pausing as you pause, their hands still, their eyes lifted toward the sound. The sun has passed its height now, the afternoon beginning its long decline toward evening. You feel the first hint of fatigue, the natural consequence of hours of walking, of perception, of the sustained attention that this city demands. The cold damp of autumn fog seems almost desirable now, a coolness to oppose the gathering warmth of the day, the gathering heaviness of your limbs. You find yourself walking back toward the center, toward the Rhine, toward the sound of water that has structured this morning. The Rhine receive you again, their waters calmer now in the afternoon light, their surfaces reflecting the sky with a steadiness that the morning wind disturbed. The hollow clop of wooden clogs on cobblestones is impossible now, the city too awake, too full of its own noise, but in some quieter street you might still hear a solitary walker, a late riser, a child sent on an errand. Giovanni di Bernardo is among them, his day ending as it began, in the shadow of the belfry, in the presence of the wealth he helps to move. The Trav River carries the cold breath of the Baltic morning past the warehouses of Lübeck, where you are standing now among the merchants who will make this voyage. Around you, the quayside bustles with the particular industry of departure day, men calling to one another in the flat cadences of Plattdeutsch as they sort through casks and bundles. The cog waits at its mooring, its hull dark with fresh tar, its single mast bare against a sky the color of washed pewter. You watch as the ship's master confers with 3 merchants whose names you will hear repeated through the coming days. Hinrich Vorath, Bertram von Minden, and the younger Gerhard Kullermann, whose father first made this journey 20 years before. The Hanseatic League developed from a merchants' association to a cities' association by the mid-14th century, and these men represent that transition still in motion, their individual ventures gradually becoming the collective enterprise of their city. The groan of hemp ropes tightening against the cog's wooden blocks fills the damp air as the crew tests the rigging. You feel the vibration through the oak, planks beneath your boots, a shudder that speaks of the strain these vessels endure. The sour smell of bilge water mixed with the merchant's own provisions of dried herring and hard bread rises from the hold where their supplies are stowed, an aroma of commerce and endurance that will not leave your nostrils for weeks to come. Light falls pale and diffuse across the water, reflecting off the river's surface in shattered fragments that shift with each ripple. A heron lifts from the reeds downstream, its wings beating slow and heavy, and you watch it disappear toward the marshlands where the Trav widens toward its meeting with the sea. Hinrich Vorath counts his traveling companions, 12 in all, a number chosen for defense as much as for the capacity of the vessel they have chartered. Merchants traveled in armed groups for security against pirates and rival traders, and you observe the short swords belted at their hips, the leather jerkins that offer some protection against weather and blade alike. The journey from Lübeck to Bruges could take 2 to 3 weeks depending on wind and weather, and every man here knows that the North Sea offers no certainty of passage. The earliest German presence in Bruges was informal, without permanent institutional structures, yet these voyages repeated across seasons and years have begun to form something more enduring than any single expedition. You hear Vorath remind his fellows that the autumn gales favor neither hesitation nor haste, his voice carrying the weight of one who has made this crossing 7 times before. The cog's single mast is stepped, the square sail raised in the morning offshore breeze, and you feel the vessel shift beneath your feet as it catches the current and begins its descent toward the sea. Canvas billows outward, snapping once before the wind fills it properly, and the sound draws your eye upward to where the yardarm strains against its bindings. Sailors move along the deck with the practiced economy of men who understand the mathematics of wind and water, their calls to one another reduced to the minimum necessary for coordination. The flat landscape of the Lübeck hinterland recedes, its fields and farmsteads giving way to the wider horizons of the estuary. You taste salt on your lips now, the Baltic making its presence known, and the temperature drops perceptibly as the river loses itself in the greater body of water. The particular silence of coastal fog, where only the creak of rigging marks the ship's slow progress, envelops you on the third morning when the vessel passes through the straits between Danish islands. Sound behaves strangely in such conditions, distances collapsing and expanding without warning, so that a gull's cry seems to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. You stand at the rail with Bertram von Minden, who points toward where the shore should be, though nothing confirms his gesture but the faint alteration in the fog's density. The cog became the symbol of Hanseatic connection due to the development of maritime transport, and you understand this now as an experience rather than a fact. This vessel carrying not merely goods, but the possibility of goods, the promise of markets distant from their origins. The fog holds you suspended between departures and arrivals, a condition the merchants accept with the patience of those whose lives are measured in seasons rather than hours. By the seventh day, the North Sea has shown its more generous face, though the sun remains pale and the wind carries the chill of northern latitudes. You watch Gerhard Kullermann, youngest of the company, learning to read the water's surface for signs of changing weather. His tutor, the ship's master, who speaks in the terse aphorisms of accumulated experience. The free trade brought great wealth to many Hanseatic cities, visible in significant buildings, and Kullermann's father contributed stone to the rising chapel of St. Anne in Lubeck, his prosperity made from these same voyages. The young man handles the rough texture of unbleached linen money bags, greasy from handling, practicing the count he will perform at journey's end when tolls and fees require exact accounting. You note how the bags have travelled before, their fabric bearing the stains of previous journeys, previous reckonings, the accumulated residue of commerce. That sour smell from the hold has become so familiar that you no longer register it as unpleasant. This olfactory signature of life aboard the cog. Days merge in their routine of watches and meals, of card games played below deck by the light of tallow candles, of the ship's master taking his noon sighting when clouds permit. In the conversations that pass these hours, you hear the texture of that evolution from merchant to city association, individual ambitions gradually submitting to collective interest. Vorath speaks of the first nearly general Hanseatage that occurred in the mid-14th century, gatherings where the affairs of many were discussed by representatives of the few, the framework of something larger than any single merchant's profit beginning to emerge from these consultations. You feel the change in the vessel's motion, a new rhythm of pitch and roll that speaks of deeper water, of the continental shelf falling away beneath the keel. The merchants check their goods, ensuring that the casks of amber and the bundles of furs have not shifted in the hold, that the wax seals on their more precious packages remain intact. Other merchant associations, as far as Austria, also called themselves Hans or Hence, and Vorath mentions this in passing, a reminder that their own solidarity exists within a wider pattern of commercial fellowship, though these Austrian groups were usually brotherhoods of individual merchants rather than city alliances, lacking the political weight that Lübeck and her partners have begun to accumulate. After 16 days at sea, the flat coast of Flanders appears through autumn haze, and you stand with the others at the rail as the land resolves itself from dream into geography. The particular silence of coastal fog has given way to a clarity that makes every detail sharp. The low line of dunes, the suggestion of buildings beyond, the darker vertical marks that must be the towers of Bruges. The warmth of a Flemish hearth after nights of sleeping on deck in North Sea drizzle seems to reach you already in anticipation, though hours of careful navigation through coastal shallows still separate you from that comfort. The colours of the Hanse, white and red, appear in the coats of arms of many Hanseatic cities, and you remember seeing these same hues on the banner that flies from the cog's mast, a declaration of identity that the approaching port will recognize and respect. The sail is reefed as the vessel enters the Zwin channel, the pilot who came aboard at the river mouth, guiding its passage through waters he knows with the intimacy of long acquaintance. You observe the change in traffic, the fishing boats giving way to larger craft, the coastal traders yielding precedence to the more substantial merchants from distant ports. German merchants from Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen were among the earliest regular visitors to Bruges, and their presence has shaped the city's accommodations, the warehouses and lodgings that cluster near the water. The cog moves past a line of buoys marking the safe channel, their wood dark and barnacled, and you feel the vessel slow further as it approaches the designated moorings where vessels of the Hansa are accustomed to berth. That warmth of the Flemish hearth becomes your present experience when at last you follow Vorath through the streets to the inn he favors, a substantial building of brick and timber where the floorboards bear the polish of generations of boots. The Germans negotiate lodging with a Flemish hosteler who speaks enough Plattdeutsch to bargain, his accent thick but his meanings clear, the negotiation conducted in the hybrid tongue that commerce has evolved where its practitioners meet. You observe the room assigned to your company, its walls hung with tapestries against the damp, its bed frames strung with ropes and topped with mattresses of straw and feather. Those greasy linen money bags pass through your fingers as you assist Vorath in preparing for the morrow's business, the silver within counted and recounted until all agree on the sum. They count out silver pennies for the toll at the city gate, noting each coin's origin city, a practice that speaks to the complexity of the currency that moves through these trading centers, the various mints whose products carry different weights of trust. You examine a penny from Cologne, its design familiar from previous journeys, then one from more distant Utrecht, its unfamiliar stamp requiring closer scrutiny. The exact boundary between merchant and city Hanse remains disputed among historians, and in this counting you sense the question's lived reality, whether the men before you act as individuals or as extensions of Lübeck's collective interest, whether their profits belong to themselves or to the larger entity their city has become. Evening settles over Bruges with a softness that the Baltic seldom offers, the moisture in the air catching the light of lamps and candles, scattering it into a golden haze that clings to the canals. You walk with Kuleman along the quayside where your cog lies moored, its mast now a silhouette against the darkening sky, its hull creaking with the adjustments of tide and temperature. Young Kuleman speaks of his father's first voyage, the uncertainty and the wonder of it, the moment when the towers of this city first appeared to transform imagination into place. You listen without interrupting, understanding that such narratives are themselves a kind of currency, passed between generations to maintain the continuity of enterprise. That coastal silence seems distant now, replaced by the evening sounds of a city that does not sleep with the sun, the calls of boatmen on the canals, the clatter of shutters being secured for the night, the distant music of a celebration in some hall you cannot identify. The warmth of the Flemish hearth draws you back to the inn, where Vorath has arranged a meal of local preparation, fish and bread and ale that taste of this soil rather than the one you departed. The older merchant speaks of the Hanseatic as he eats, of the gatherings where the affairs of the German trading cities were coordinated, where disputes were adjudicated and privileges defended. You understand that this meal, this lodging, this entire journey participates in that larger pattern, the individual moments accumulating into the history that scholars will later attempt to trace. The term kontor derives from French comptoir meaning counting table or desk, and you learn that the German merchants had begun to use this word for their gathering places in foreign cities. the rooms where their business is conducted and their common interests advance. Here in the 14th century, it carries the full weight of its original meaning, the physical surface where accounts are rendered and agreements recorded. Vorath mentions that no permanent kontor yet exists in Bruges, that the Germans still conduct their affairs from inns and temporary quarters, yet the pressure of repeated presence, of season following season, suggests that such formalization will come. You observe the merchants around you, their faces lined with the combined effects of sea wind and counting house candlelight, and you perceive in them the agents of this gradual institutionalization. Those money bags return to your hands in the morning when the company prepares to present itself at the city gate, to declare its goods and pay the tolls that fund Bruges's prosperity. The officials acknowledge this display with a nod that falls short of full respect but exceeds mere tolerance, the calibrated recognition of equals who are not quite friends. At its greatest extent, nearly 300 Baltic and inland cities were united in the city Hansa, and you feel the scale of this network now as a physical presence, the accumulated weight of all those places and their products converging on this single market. The architecture rises around you, the belfry that Giovanni di Bernardo knows so well still distant, but present, the cloth hall where his weavers bring their finished goods, the churches and civic buildings that proclaim the wealth that trade has built. That warmth of the hearth recedes as you move through the morning's business, the inspection of warehouses, the preliminary inquiries after prices, the establishment of contacts that will serve through the trading season. You accompany Vorath to a meeting with a Flemish merchant who deals in English wool, the negotiation conducted in the French that serves as the lingua franca of this cosmopolitan place, though both men pepper their speech with the German and Flemish terms that precise commerce requires. Light enters through high windows, falling in thick beams that illuminate the dust motes and the lanolin sheen of the fleece, creating an atmosphere of almost sacred examination. The Flemish seller names his price, Vorath counters, and the ritual of negotiation begins, the practice dance that converts desire into transaction. The particular silence of coastal fog has no place in this bustling warehouse, yet you find moments of something like it in the pauses of the bargaining, when both parties retreat to consult their companions, when the room holds only the sound of breathing and the distant commerce of the street outside. You note how this distinction matters in the pricing, in the terms of credit, in the confidence with which agreements can be made and expected to hold. Those money bags appear again when a deposit is made to secure the wool against other buyers, the silver counted onto the counting table that gives the kontor its name. The warmth of the Flemish hearth calls you back to the inn as the afternoon progresses, the merchants dispersing to their various errands and appointments, their movements coordinated by understandings reached in previous seasons. You sit with Killerman, who records the day's transactions in his ledger, his script careful and legible, the numerals rendered in the distinctive forms that German merchants favor. His father first made this journey 20 years before, and the young man's entries participate in that continuity, the accumulation of experience that transforms individual voyage into institutional memory. That sour smell from the voyage has begun to fade from your awareness, replaced by the more complex olfactory signature of this city, its spices and its wastes, its productive industries and its devotional incenses. Evening approaches, and with it the reassembly of the company at the inn, the sharing of intelligence gathered through the day's separate endeavors, the construction of a collective picture of market conditions and opportunities. You observe this accommodation as a form of soft power, the influence that repeated presence exerts without formal negotiation. You walk the quayside in the fading light, watching the play of sunset colors on the canal water, the reds and golds that seem to echo the Hanseatic colors of white and red. A heron lifts from the reeds at the water's edge, its wings beating slow and heavy, and you watch it disappear toward the marshlands, a creature of borders and transitions, at home in the spaces between defined places. That particular silence of coastal fog seems to approach with the evening's cooling, a mist rising from the canals that softens the city's edges, that makes each lantern a sphere of isolated luminosity. You return to the inn where the merchants gather, their voices low in the firelit room, the day's business concluded, the morrow's plans forming in the spaces between their words. Vorath speaks of the possibility of a permanent kontor, a dedicated house where the Germans might conduct their affairs with the dignity and efficiency that their numbers and their importance warrant. The warmth of the Flemish hearth envelops you as you settle into the corner assigned for sleeping, your body still adjusting to the absence of the cog's motion, the strange stability of land after days of constant adjustment. In the murmur of conversation that accompanies your drifting towards sleep, you hear references to the next handsetage, the questions that will be put to it, the grievances that have accumulated against this or that trading partner or competitor. You understand now that this development from merchant to city association continues, that the form it will ultimately take remains undetermined, shaped by the countless individual decisions made in places like this, in evenings like this, by men who imagine themselves merely pursuing profit while they participate in the construction of something larger than their comprehension. Those greasy linen money bags have been folded and stored, the silver they contained now dispersed into the city's circulation, the obligations it represented converted into the obligations of others, the chain of credit that binds merchant to merchant, city to city, across the distances that the cog traverses. That sour smell from the voyage returns to your dreams, or perhaps to the room itself, the sensory signature of the journey refusing to be separated from the journey's purpose, the conditions of movement inseparable from the fact of arrival. Yet the warmth of the hearth persists, the security of walls and established place, the city that receives and transforms, that converts the products of distant origin into the materials of local manufacture, that sends back in exchange the goods that will complete another circuit of trade. The morning light enters Bruges through canals that mirror the stepped gables of warehouses along the water, and you are standing at the intersection where the Wallstraat meets the broader commercial arteries of the city. Around you, the Flemish merchants have already opened their shutters, their voices carrying the cadences of a trade tongue that German ears have learned to pass through years of patient negotiation. The cold air moves across your face, bearing the smell of river mud and the distant smoke of breakfast fires from households you will never enter. Bruges rises from the damp of the Zwin estuary, its prosperity built upon the same currents that carry the cogs of Lübeck and Hamburg into its harbors, and you feel the particular gravity of this place where northern timber meets southern cloth in the perpetual arithmetic of exchange. The Hanseatic kontor in Bruges was the economically most significant of the 4 Hanseatic kontor, a fact that reveals itself in the density of German presence along these streets, in the very architecture of buildings purchased and adapted to northern habits. The 4 Hanseatic kontor were located in Bruges, London, Bergen, and Novgorod, each a node in a network that stretched from the White Sea to the Thames. Yet none accumulated the capital, the diplomatic weight, the sheer volume of transaction that passed through this Flemish city. You watch a merchant from Hamburg pause at the doorway of a house whose stone facade bears no outward sign of its foreign ownership, his hand finding the iron key with the familiarity of long practice, the weight of keys at his belt marking his office as the kontor's elected custodian, a sound you will hear again and again as the day unfolds. Merchants from Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen formalize their association with written statutes, gathering in the upper room of a rented house where the light falls through windows that face north, preserving the colors of the cloth samples spread across the table. The document they produce will bind them in ways their fathers would have recognized, but could not have codified, transforming custom into obligation, habit into law. You are present at the edge of this assembly, your back against the wall where the plaster bears the ghost marks of previous tapestries, and you observe how each man speaks his city's dialect, yet finds comprehension through the shared vocabulary of trade. The scratch of quill on parchment, as the alderman records a judgment in Low German, will become, in the years that follow, the characteristic sound of this place, the auditory signature of a community learning to govern itself through the medium of written word. The echo of German voices in the vaulted ground floor of the Kontor, a familiar sound in foreign Bruges, reaches you now as you descend the stairs of the building that will soon become their permanent home. The space they have rented is larger than their present numbers require, a calculation that speaks to ambition, to the confidence that more will come, that the informal gatherings of decades past have prepared the ground for something more durable. The merchants from Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen have brought with them the habits of their native cities, the expectation that commerce requires not merely profit, but the structures that permit profit to be pursued without constant recourse to foreign courts, foreign judgments, foreign mercies. The Bruges Kontor predates the formal recognition of 1486 by many decades of informal organization, and you sense in the atmosphere of this room the accumulated weight of those precedents, the slow sedimentation of practice that now demands explicit form. Rain has begun against the windows, the soft Flemish rain that penetrates wool and patience alike, and you watch the droplets trace their paths down glass that distorts the view of the street into something provisional, watery, half-imagined. The merchants continue their deliberations below, their voices rising and falling in the rhythm of debate that will eventually yield consensus. For this is not a gathering that recognizes majority rule in any simple sense. The smell of sealing wax and the sharp impression of the community's temporary seal into warm wax reaches you from the chamber where a letter is being prepared for dispatch to the Council of Lübeck, requesting guidance, requesting acknowledgement, requesting the legitimacy that only the leading cities can bestow. The merchant himself ultimately defined who shared in his rights, though not independently of the leading cities, and this tension between individual initiative and collective authority runs through every clause of the statutes being drafted in the room below. A German alderman is elected to adjudicate disputes among Hanseatic traders, a man whose name appears in the correspondence of 3 cities before his selection, whose reputation for fairness has reached that pitch where fairness becomes its own form of power. You observe the ceremony of his elevation, the placement of his hand upon a copy of the statutes, the oath he speaks in the dialect of his native Bremen that binds him to serve not his own interest, but the collective welfare of the community. The flicker of tallow candles during winter assemblies, each merchant contributing to their cost, illuminates this moment, though the season is spring and the light still sufficient. The candles are lit for symbolism, for the continuity they represent with assemblies past and future, for the equality of contribution they enforce among men whose actual fortunes vary considerably. The Kontor possessed its own jurisdiction over member merchants, and this alderman will exercise it in cases that range from the trivial to the consequential, from disputed measurements of cloth to accusations of fraud that might ruin a man in 3 cities simultaneously. The afternoon finds you walking the length of the Wallstraat, noting how the Kontor's placement near the Bourse where the money changers gather, the weighhouse where customs officials assess their dues, the innumerable warehouses where the products of German forests and Baltic plains await their transformation into Flemish prosperity, places it within easy reach of every mechanism that commerce requires. The street surface is uneven beneath your feet, the cobbles worn by generations of cart traffic, by the passage of barrels and bales, and the occasional unfortunate animal that has slipped its harness. Merchants from Hanseatic cities active in Bruges were compulsory members of the association, now taking formal shape, a principle that sounds absolute in the abstract, yet proves in practice to require constant negotiation, constant interpretation, constant adjustment to circumstances that the statutes could not have anticipated. The community purchases a building on Wallstraat for common use as counting house and meeting hall, a transaction that requires the assembly of capital from multiple participants, the negotiation of title with Flemish sellers who view these Germans with a mixture of respect and suspicion, the adaptation of an existing structure to purposes its original builders never conceived. You stand in the courtyard as the sale is completed, watching the transfer of documents, the counting of coins, the moment when the weight of keys at the custodian's belt becomes literal, material, the physical custody of doors and thresholds and the spaces they enclose. The building is substantial without being grand, pragmatic in its proportions, suited to the storage of records and the conduct of business rather than the display of magnificence that Flemish burghers might have preferred for their own establishments. Evening brings a change in the quality of light, the long northern dusk that extends the hours of visibility without ever quite delivering the clarity of noon. You are seated at the edge of this gathering, provided with a bench against the wall and a cup of the thin local wine that passes for hospitality, and you observe how the community defines itself through such moments of unguarded speech, how the boundary between member and outsider becomes visible in the sudden silence that falls when a Flemish servant enters with more fuel for the fire. A priest from Lübeck arrives to celebrate Mass in the German merchant's own chapel, his journey having taken him across the same waters that carry the trade, his purpose being to serve a community that exists in the interstices of ecclesiastical structures organized around territory rather than commerce. The Kontor maintained its own chapel for German merchants, served by priests from Hanseatic cities, a provision that speaks to needs beyond the merely practical, to the desire for worship in familiar forms, in comprehensible language, among those who share not merely economic interest, but the deeper solidarity of common devotion. You attend the first Mass celebrated in the newly adapted space, noting how the priest's vestments have suffered from travel, how his hands shake slightly as he elevates the host, whether from age or fatigue or the particular loneliness of those who serve dispersed communities. The smell of sealing wax returns to you as the priest's credentials are verified, as letters from Lübeck are produced and read aloud, as the formalities of recognition are observed with a punctiliousness that borders on the theatrical. The Kontor was recognized under international law as a representative body of the Hansa, a status that will require decades to achieve fully. Yet the aspirations toward that recognition are already present in the care with which this moment is staged, in the documentation that accompanies every claim to legitimacy. The first register of compulsory membership is compiled, naming each merchant and his city of origin, a document that represents both achievement and aspiration, the transformation of fluid association into fixed record. You watch the scribe at his work, the scratch of quill on parchment as the alderman records a judgment in Low German, having prepared the way for this more systematic enumeration. The habit of written documentation, now extending to the very composition of the community itself. The names accumulate. Men from Lübeck, from Hamburg, from Bremen, from the smaller cities whose participation in the Hanseatic system has always been more intermittent, more contingent upon the particular conjuncture of politics and markets. Membership boundaries were never fixed with absolute certainty, and you sense in the hesitations of the scribe, in the consultations that interrupt his progress, the difficulty of translating social reality into administrative form. The rain has returned, falling steadily now against the windows of the counting house where the register grows page by page, and you feel the damp in your bones, the particular chill of Flemish autumn that German merchants complain of in their letters home, that they endure for the profits that justify their presence in this foreign climate. Membership depended on various circumstances, especially political conditions, a truth that the register cannot capture, but that every man in this room understands implicitly, that governs their calculations even as they seek to create structures more durable than the moment. Night has fallen completely now, the darkness of a city without street lighting, where the movement of persons after curfew requires justification, where the German merchants must learn to navigate by lantern light and memory. You remain in the Kontor building, permitted by your status as witness, as the foreign observer whose presence has been tacitly accepted without ever being formally acknowledged. The weight of keys at the custodian's belt marks his passage through the corridors as he makes his final rounds, securing doors, verifying that the day's business has been properly concluded, that the building sleeps as securely as its occupants permit. You find yourself in the chapel, the space now dark, except for the perpetual lamp that burns before the reserved sacrament, its flame steady in the stillness, its oil consuming itself in the service of a presence that requires no further testimony than this continuous burning. Dawn arrives without announcement, the grey light that precedes colour seeping through the windows of the counting house where the register lies open, its ink still fresh, its authority still provisional upon the recognitions it seeks. The Kontor used a seal with the double-headed imperial eagle, granted by Emperor Frederick III in 1486, though that grant lies still in the future from the perspective of this morning, the seal presently in use being a more modest affair, adopted by common consent rather than imperial authority, yet already carrying the weight of repeated impress, of documents dispatched and received, of a community learning to speak with one voice. You walk again through the streets of Bruges, the early commerce beginning around you, the familiar figures of the German quarter emerging from doorways, exchanging greetings in the dialects that mark their origins, conducting the small negotiations of daily life before the larger transactions of the season resume. The alderman passes you in the street, his bearing altered by his new responsibility, his greeting still personal yet carrying now the additional weight of office, of the jurisdiction he exercises over men who were yesterday his equals in every formal sense. The Kontor possessed its own jurisdiction over member merchants, a power that will be tested, contested, gradually refined through the cases that come before him, through the appeals that will eventually reach the councils of the leading cities, through the slow elaboration of precedent that constitutes the common law of commercial communities. The community has gathered now in its new building, the purchase complete, the adaptation proceeding, the space already acquiring the particular atmosphere of places where serious business is conducted with regularity and intent. You are seated among them, your presence no longer requiring explanation, absorbed into the fabric of this gathering as the foreign observer sometimes, is when discretion and patience have established a kind of functional invisibility. Merchants from Hanseatic cities active in Bruges were compulsory members, the principle now being applied, tested, extended to cases that the original statutes did not explicitly contemplate, the living practice of community exceeding its formal definition at every point. Legal sovereignty rested not with an institution, but with the community of German merchants at Bruges in Flanders, a formulation that preserves the ambiguity essential to Hanseatic self-understanding, that resists the centralization that Flemish or Burgundian observers might have expected, that distributes authority in ways that require constant negotiation, constant reaffirmation, constant mutual recognition. The priest from Lübeck has begun to establish his routines, the daily mass, the hearing of confessions, the pastoral visits to merchants whose health or spirits have failed in this foreign place, the correspondence with ecclesiastical authorities in his native city that maintains his status and his supply of necessary materials. The morning advances, the light strengthening, the city around you assuming its daytime character of purposeful activity, of carts and voices, and the perpetual movement of goods from storage to sale, from raw material to finished product, from one circuit of trade to the next. The weight of keys at the custodian's belt accompanies your exit from the building, his unlocking of the main door marking the official commencement of the business day, his presence at this threshold a reminder of the boundaries that community requires, the distinctions between inside and outside, between member and stranger, between the ordered space of collective activity and the more dangerous world beyond. You step into the Wallstraat, the street already busy with Flemish and German alike, the commercial heart of Bruges beating around you with the steady rhythm that will continue long after this particular morning has passed into memory, into record, into the slowly accumulating documentation from which history will eventually be constructed. The morning has become afternoon before you return to the Kontor, the light altered, the angle of shadows shifted, the temperature having risen slightly with the passing hours. Use of the seal is documented from 1487 onward, though the precise moment of its adoption remains unclear, lost in the gradual transition from informal to formal, from temporary to permanent, from the seal that any merchant might employ to the seal that speaks for a community, that binds its members in ways individual signature cannot achieve. You observe the ceremony of its application, the warming of the wax, the careful positioning, the moment of pressure that transfers the image from metal to matter, that creates the document as official, as authentic, as worthy of the recognition it seeks. The register of compulsory membership lies open on the counting house table, additional names having been added since your morning observation. The scribe's hand steadier now with practice, his decisions more confident, his consultations less frequent though not entirely absent. Evening approaches again, the cycle of days that will structure the existence of this community, that will mark the rhythm of its assemblies, its worship, its commerce, its long periods of waiting for news from the cities that govern its collective destiny. You are present at the final gathering of this day, the alderman summarizing the business concluded, the custodian reporting on the state of the building, the priest offering the blessing that will send these men to their various lodgings, their various prayers, their various dreams of the homes they have left and will eventually, provisionally, return to. In modern legal categories, the Kontor resembled a cooperatively organized foreign chamber of commerce with consular powers, a formulation that captures something of its nature while missing the specificity of its historical emergence, the contingency of its development, the sheer human effort of negotiation and compromise that produced structures later ages will mistake for inevitable. You stand at the window of the counting house, watching the last light fade from the Wallstraat, feeling the particular melancholy of places where history is being made without the consciousness of its significance, where men pursue their immediate interests while unwittingly constructing the frameworks within which later generations will understand their own possibilities. The night settles around the Kontor, the building breathing with the presence of those who sleep within its walls, the watchman making his rounds, the fire banked in the hall where the day's deliberations have concluded. You find your own rest in a corner provided for visitors, the straw mattress rustling beneath you, the distant sounds of the city entering your dreams, the weight of keys at the custodian's belt becoming in sleep the sound of bells, of harness, of the thousand signals by which human communities organize their common life. The darkness is complete now, the stars visible through gaps in the cloud that has passed, the city reduced to its essential sounds, its essential silences, its essential waiting for the renewal that dawn will bring. The scratch of quill on parchment seems to continue in some inner ear, the auditory residue of a day spent in observation, the mind's continued processing of what the senses have received. The Kontor's location on the Wallstraat placed it near the commercial heart of Bruges, within easy reach of every mechanism that commerce requires, and you drift towards sleep with this geography settled within you, the particular configuration of streets and buildings and human arrangements that has made this place what it is, that will continue to shape the lives of those who pass through it long after your witness has ended. The Kontor's location on the Wallstraat places you at the center of this German world, this enclave within a Flemish city where the rhythms of the Baltic continue uninterrupted, where the first light will find a young apprentice already at work, his breath visible in the unheated hall, his wooden shoes making no sound upon the stone. You are standing in the courtyard of the Kontor at Bruges, and the hour is before dawn, and the cold has settled into the flagstones with a persistence that suggests winter has made its home here. Around you, the buildings of the German compound rise in their familiar arrangement, the warehouse with its iron-banded doors, the chapel with its modest bell tower, the long chamber where merchants gather to dispute accounts, the kitchen where servants sleep among the pots. The young man from Lübeck, perhaps 17 years old, perhaps younger, moves through the main hall with a birch-twig broom, gathering the ash from yesterday's fires, the crumbs of yesterday's bread, the traces of yesterday's commerce that must be erased before commerce begins again. His name is not recorded in the ledgers you will later examine, though his labor makes those ledgers possible, makes possible the measured German tones in which disputes are conducted, makes possible the very existence of this Wallstraat community where German merchants live for months or years, not merely during trading seasons. The smell of Baltic tar reaches you from the corner where boots are stored, the thick-soled footwear of men who have walked the decks of cogs, who have climbed the narrow stairs of warehouses in Hamburg and Bremen and Lübeck, who have carried with them the preservative residue of ship timbers and harbour pilings. This tar smell mingles with the cold ere moving across your face, the particular cold of a Flemish morning that carries moisture from the canals, that seems to penetrate wool and leather with equal indifference. The apprentice works methodically, as he has been taught by the established trader to whom he was bound, learning not merely the broom and the kindling, but the accounting in Low German that will one day permit him to stand among the merchants rather than serve them. His apprenticeship will last until his master judges him ready, until the Kontor accepts his oath and his fees, until he too can reside in the Wallstraat area for months or years, building a life measured in Baltic grain and preserved fish, and the correspondence that travels by regular cog connections, taking 1 to 2 weeks to reach home cities. The fires catch slowly in the tiled stoves, these imports from the Rhineland that remain rare in Flemish houses, these sources of warmth that the German merchants have made their own. You feel the gradual change in the air as the tiles absorb heat, as the room shifts from storage temperature to something approaching comfort, the warmth of a tiled stove spreading in patterns that the apprentice has learned to predict, placing his bedding in the corner where the radiated heat will reach him when his work is done. The particular quality of this warmth differs from the open hearths of Flemish inns, contains something of the German domestic interior, of the Rhineland workshops where such stoves are constructed, of the long overland journey they have made to reach this Wallstraat courtyard where German merchants maintain their separate existence. Light begins to show at the edges of the shutters, not yet the full dawn, but the preliminary grey that precedes it, the sky preparing its daily revelation with the patience of a merchant preparing his accounts. The apprentice has moved to the chapel, where he will ring the small bell that summons the community to morning devotion, where the particular hush of a German chapel service will soon prevail, the Latin familiar to all but the sermon delivered in the home dialect of the preacher, perhaps Lübeck Low German, perhaps the variant spoken in Hamburg or Bremen. You are standing at the rear of this chapel, and around you the merchants are assembling in their distinctive dress, not uniform, but signaling their Hanseatic identity through cut and fabric. The cut perhaps a little broader than Flemish fashion permits, the fabric perhaps a little heavier, suited to Baltic winters rather than Channel summers. The service proceeds in its measured way, the Latin rolling from tongues that have spoken it since childhood, the sermon then shifting to the vernacular, the particular hush of a German chapel service, giving way to the particular cadences of a German voice explaining scripture to Germans far from home. You notice the men who stand alone, who have no wives or families beside them, for wives and families occasionally joined merchants on longer postings, though many remained celibate during their stay, the months or years of residence in Bruges treated as a period of suspended domesticity, the correspondence with home cities travelling by regular cog connections, taking 1 to 2 weeks, serving as the thin thread that maintained connection to the lives left behind. The Kontor regulated moral behaviour, fining members for public drunkenness or gambling debts, and this regulation extended to the domestic sphere, to the proper conduct of men without women, to the maintenance of German standards in a Flemish environment. The morning advances toward its middle, and you find yourself in a German inn near the Kontor, an establishment that serves the particular needs of the Wallstraat community, that imports its own beer from Hamburg and Bremen, preferring it to local Flemish brews, that charges premium prices for this taste of home. The midday meal is being taken at long tables, the merchants and their apprentices seated according to protocols understood without being spoken, the established traders at the centre, the younger men at the ends, the servants moving between with platters of preserved fish, Baltic grain, and imported cheese. You taste the heavily salted herring, a reminder of distant Baltic ports, the salt crystals dissolving on your tongue with an intensity that speaks of preservation, of long storage, of the distance this fish has travelled to reach this Flemish table. The Hamburg beer arrives in stoneware jugs, its colour darker than the local brew, its taste carrying something of the northern water, the northern barley, the northern methods that the German merchants refuse to abandon even in their years of residence. The conversation around you concerns prices and shipments, the arrival of cogs expected within the fortnight, the quality of grain inspected that morning in the warehouse. Language barriers require the use of interpreters for dealings with Flemish authorities and Italian competitors, but here among themselves, The merchants speak as they speak at home, the low German of the Hanseatic cities, flowing with the ease of native use, the technical vocabulary of commerce, requiring no translation. A young merchant from Bremen, still in his apprenticeship under an established trader, attempts to join a discussion of herring prices and is gently corrected by his elder, the error noted not with severity, but with the patience of one who remembers his own apprenticeship, his own years of sweeping and kindling before he was permitted to speak in council. The afternoon finds you in the counting house of the Kontor, where an elderly merchant dictates a letter to his clerk, instructing his wife in Lübeck to sell stored grain. His voice carries the fatigue of years, of winters spent in Bruges and summers spent travelling between the fairs, of the illness and death that are common in this community, where the Kontor maintained records of burials in the German cemetery, where the damp climate of Flanders takes its toll on constitutions formed in the sharper air of the Baltic. The clerk writes in the trained script of the professional correspondent the letter that will travel by regular cog connections, taking 1 to 2 weeks to reach Lübeck, the instructions precise, the personal messages brief, the whole document folded and sealed with the merchant's mark, entrusted to the next departing vessel. You observe the elderly merchant's distinctive dress, the signalling of Hanseatic identity through cut and fabric more pronounced in his generation than in the younger men, the weight of his coat suggesting both wealth and the northern climate for which it was designed. His boots, like all the boots in this room, carry the persistent smell of Baltic tar from the cogs he arrived on, from the decks he has walked, from the life he has lived at the intersection of water and commerce. Around him, the ledgers of the Kontor accumulate in their appointed shelves, the annual accounts that will be audited publicly, with each member entitled to examine the ledgers, the quarterly records that document every candle, every measure of wine, every chapel expense disputed in measured German tones. The day has moved toward its evening, and you are present in the common room where the quarterly audit proceeds, the candles, wine, and chapel expenses disputed in measured German tones, each item questioned by members who understand that the common funds collected from members pay for servants and guards, pay for the chapel and its services, pay for the care of those who fall ill among them. The Kontor employed servants and guards, paid from common funds collected from members, and these expenditures must be justified to the satisfaction of all, the democratic structure of the organization requiring transparency even in details that might seem trivial. A merchant from Hamburg challenges the wine account, suggesting that the quantity purchased exceeds the quantity consumed, the discrepancy perhaps indicating waste, perhaps indicating error, perhaps indicating something more concerning, that the measured German tones are too polite to name directly. The dispute continues with the formality of a ritual, each speaker acknowledging the previous, each objection framed in the conditional mood that permits disagreement without offense. You notice the warmth of a tiled stove in the corner, this Rhineland import radiating its particular heat, the tiles themselves decorated with scenes of biblical virtue, with the moral instruction that the Kontor seeks to enforce through its fines and its regulations. The persistent smell of Baltic tar reaches you from the boots of a merchant who has recently arrived, whose journey is still upon him, whose presence reminds the assembly that the community continues to renew itself, that the Wallstraat area remains populated by German merchants who reside in Bruges for months or years, not merely during trading seasons, maintaining their separate life within the larger Flemish city. The audit concludes with the accounts accepted, the discrepancies explained to general satisfaction, the candles, wine, and chapel expenses recorded in the permanent ledger with the particular script that denotes official resolution. Evening recreation now occupies those who remain awake. The chess and backgammon boards brought from their storage, the singing of devotional songs in German beginning in the chapel, where the particular hush of a German chapel service has given way to something more communal, more participatory. You hear the voices raised in melody, the German words carrying across the courtyard, the sound of heavy German boots on wooden stairs as men descend from their chambers to join the singing. This sound distinct from the lighter footwear of Flemish burghers, marking the audible presence of the German community even in darkness. The songs are of home, of the cities left behind, of the religious calendar of their home cities that determines when the merchants celebrate Hanseatic festivals, the dates observed according to Lübeck or Hamburg or Bremen custom, the particular saints and seasons that maintain connection across the distance that regular cog connections traverse in 1 to 2 weeks. You are standing in the chapel doorway, and around you the merchants are gathered in their distinctive dress, the cut and fabric signaling their Hanseatic identity even in this moment of devotion. The whole community present, except for those who have retired, except for those who are occupied with private correspondence, except for those who have fallen into the illness that the damp climate promotes. A messenger arrives with news that disturbs the evening's peace. A merchant has fallen ill with fever. The community must respond. The common funds collected from members must be deployed for his care. You follow the group that gathers at the sick man's lodging, a room in the Wallstraat area where German merchants lie for months or years. The space modest, the tiled stove unlit, the patient tossing in bedding that smells of the fever's progress. The Kontor maintained records of burials in the German cemetery, and this knowledge hangs unspoken in the room, the illness and death that are common here made present in the flushed face, the rapid breathing, the confused speech that the interpreter is not needed to translate. The community pays for his care from the common funds, arranges for a physician to attend, for servants to bring water and cooling cloths, for the chapel to offer prayers in the home dialect that the sick man would recognize. You stand at the foot of his bed, and around you the merchants are deciding who will write to his family, who will arrange for the testament to be recorded, who will ensure that his affairs are in order should the fever prove fatal. The sound of heavy German boots on wooden stairs marks the arrival of more helpers. This sound distinct from the lighter footwear of Flemish burghers, the whole German community mobilized in response to one man's need, the solidarity that the Kontor fosters now made visible in practical action. The sick man's testament is dictated to a clerk, his wishes regarding his property, his debts, his correspondence with home cities that has traveled by regular cog connections, taking 1 to 2 weeks, that has maintained the thread of connection now perhaps to be severed. You observe the clerk's careful writing, the trained script recording another chapter in the history of this Wallstraat enclave, another instance of the mortality that accompanies all human endeavor, that the merchants accept with the same measured German tones they apply to disputes over candles and wine. The night has advanced, and the fever continues, and you are present in the chapel where prayers continue for the sick man's recovery, where the singing of devotional songs in German has resumed with greater urgency, where the particular hush of a German chapel service alternates with the particular sound of petition. The warmth of a tiled stove reaches you from the corner, this Rhineland import providing comfort in the cold hours, its decorated tiles visible in the candlelight, their biblical scenes offering silent witness to the prayers offered before them. The persistent smell of Baltic tar from merchants' boots and the cogs they arrived on mingles with the incense of the chapel, the composite odor of this German world in Flanders, this community that maintains its identity through cut and fabric, through imported beer, through the correspondence that travels by regular cog connections, taking 1 to 2 weeks. The young apprentice from Lübeck is among those keeping vigil, his apprenticeship under an established trader, learning accounting in Low German, now expanded to include this education in mortality, in community responsibility, in the solidarity that the Kontor demands and provides. He will remember this night, will remember the measured German tones of the prayers, the sound of heavy German boots on wooden stairs as men come and go with news of the patient's condition, the taste of heavily salted herring that someone has brought from the kitchen to sustain the watchers. This reminder of distant Baltic ports, now sustenance for the immediate need. The dawn approaches with the same preliminary grey that began this day, and the fever has broken, or perhaps has not, and the community continues its vigil, the Wallstraat area quiet in these hours before the city wakes, the German merchants maintaining their watch in the manner of their fathers, in the tradition of their home cities. You are standing at the window of the chapel, and around you the first light is showing at the edges of the shutters, the same light that found the apprentice with his broom, that witnessed the midday meal with its Hamburg beer at premium prices, that illuminated the elderly merchant dictating his letter to his wife in Lübeck, that observed the quarterly audit where candles, wine, and chapel expenses were disputed in measured German tones. The annual accounts were audited publicly, with each member entitled to examine the ledgers, and this public scrutiny extends to all aspects of the common life, to the care of the sick, to the recording of burials, to the maintenance of German identity in a Flemish world. The light strengthens, and the city resumes its sounds, the commerce of Bruges beginning another day, the Italian competitors and Flemish authorities pursuing their separate interests, the language barriers requiring the use of interpreters for dealings that will resume when the German merchants emerge from their quarter. But within the Kontor, within the Wallstraat area where German merchants live for months or years, not merely during trading seasons, the rhythm continues according to its own pattern. The morning devotion will be offered, the meals will be taken, the correspondence will be written and sent by regular cog connections, taking 1 to 2 weeks. The sick man's condition will be reported to his family. The testament will be held in readiness. The community will continue its common life with the persistence that has brought it through centuries, that will carry it forward into years unnumbered. You feel the warmth of a tiled stove at your back, this Rhineland import still radiating the heat of last night's firing, its tiles warm to the touch, their biblical scenes visible in the morning light. The taste of heavily salted herring lingers from the night's vigil, this reminder of distant Baltic ports, now associated with the memory of community gathered in crisis, of the measured German tones that comforted and instructed, of the particular hush of a German chapel service that preceded and followed the emergency. The sound of heavy German boots on wooden stairs begins again, the day's activities commencing, the younger merchants beginning their apprenticeships, the established traders resuming their commerce, the whole community proceeding according to the calendar of Hanseatic festivals, the religious calendar of their home cities, the time that belongs to Germans wherever they may reside. The morning advances, and you are present at the harbour, at the place where the cogs load and unload, where the correspondence with home cities begins its journey, where the grain that the elderly merchant instructed his wife to sell in Lübeck was once stored, where the Hamburg beer that is preferred to local Flemish brews was once transferred from ship to warehouse. The cold air moves across your face with the same moisture it carried at dawn, the same Flemish cold that the German merchants endure, that they mitigate with their Rhineland stoves, their heavy clothing, their imported tastes. Around you, the harbour sounds proceed in their eternal pattern. The creaking of timbers, the calling of gulls, the shouting of stevedores in tongues that require interpreters, the language barriers that complicate all dealings with Flemish authorities and Italian competitors. But the German ships are recognizable by their build, by their rigging, by the persistent smell of Baltic tar that clings to their hulls, by the sound of heavy German boots on their decks, distinct from the lighter footwear of Flemish burghers. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, and the cog that will carry the sick man's testament, that will carry the news of his fever, that will carry the continuation of this Wallstraat life, is preparing to depart, its sails being raised, its captain calling commands in the low German of the northern coast. The regular connections that take 1 to 2 weeks will be maintained. The thread between Bruges and Lübeck, between Bruges and Hamburg, between Bruges and Bremen will be drawn taut again. The community that resides for months or years, not merely during trading seasons, will be sustained in its separation. The light is full now, the day begun, and you return through the streets to the Kontor, to the Wallstraat area where German merchants maintain their designated existence, where the young apprentice sweeps again, where the fires are lit again, where the particular hush of a German chapel service will soon prevail again. The distinctive dress, the cut and fabric signaling Hanseatic identity, is visible again in the morning streets, the merchants emerging from their lodgings, the younger men with their apprenticeships still before them, the established traders with their correspondence to dictate, their accounts to examine, their commerce to conduct. Around you, the buildings of the German compound stand in their familiar arrangement, the warehouse with its iron-banded doors, the chapel with its modest bell tower, the long chamber where merchants gather, the kitchen where servants prepare the preserved fish, Baltic grain, and imported cheese that constitute the daily fare. The evening recreation of chess, backgammon, and the singing of devotional songs in German will come again. The Hanseatic festivals according to the religious calendar of their home cities will be observed again. The language barriers requiring the use of interpreters will be encountered again. The sick man's recovery, or his death, will be recorded in the ledgers where the Kontor maintained records of burials in the German cemetery, where the illness and death that are common are made permanent in ink, where the community's memory is preserved against the erosion of time. The wives and families who occasionally joined merchants on longer postings, though many remained celibate during their stay, will be mentioned in the letters that travel by regular cog connections, taking 1 to 2 weeks, the domestic news that supplements the commercial information, the personal thread that weaves through the professional correspondence. The Hamburg beer that is served at premium prices will be consumed again. The taste of heavily salted herring will be experienced again. The warmth of a tiled stove will be felt again. The sound of heavy German boots on wooden stairs will be heard again, distinct from the lighter footwear of Flemish burghers, marking the audible boundary of this German world. The day proceeds in its established pattern, and you move through it as you have moved through the days before, observing, present, immersed in the sensory particulars that constitute this existence. The particular hush of a German chapel service, the Latin familiar but the sermon in home dialect, provides the spiritual rhythm that organizes the temporal, that places the commerce of the Wallstraat within a larger frame of meaning. The warmth of a tiled stove, imported from the Rhineland, rare in Flemish houses, creates the physical conditions that permit the mental work of accounting, of correspondence, of the measured German tones in which disputes are conducted and resolved. The taste of heavily salted herring, a reminder of distant Baltic ports, sustains the body. The taste of heavily salted herring, a reminder of distant Baltic ports, sustains the body through the long hours of negotiation in the counting house. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, where the Zwin estuary spreads its fingers through mudflats and salt marsh. Around you, merchants unload cargoes from a cog that has ridden the spring thaw down from Novgorod, its single mast and square sail now furled against the pale sky. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the scent of tar and riverweed and the particular mustiness of Russian squirrel furs packed in waxed cloth. This vessel from Lübeck, a sailing ship type of the Hansa serving primarily for trade, has made the 6-week passage through the Danish straits with its hold crammed with the wealth of the Baltic. Wax from the forests of Polotsk, rendered from countless hives and moulded into great blocks, gleams dully in the early light where stevedores have begun to shift it onto the quay. The furs, those same squirrel pelts that will trim the sleeves of wealthy Bruges burghers, are bound in bundles of 40, each skin wrapped in waxed cloth that preserves the soft winter undercoat from the salt air. Timber from the vast northern forests, hewn into planks and beams, rises in stacks that smell of fresh resin and distant cold. The cog from Lübeck could be equipped for war against pirates during military conflicts of Hanseatic cities, though today its aft castle stands empty of archers, and its forecastle, added by the mid-14th century, serves only as storage for the captain's navigational instruments. You notice how the hull rides low in the water, its oak planks working against their caulking with each movement of the tide, producing that particular creak that sailors recognize as the voice of a ship at rest. The crow's nest lookout, mounted just below the mast top, sways gently now with no watcher posted, its platform a small circle of emptiness against the brightening sky. A seal of Hulkesmouth from 1295 depicts a ship explicitly called a hulk, externally similar to a cog, and you might find yourself considering how these vessel types mingled in the minds of those who used them. Around 1000, English toll lists distinguished between keels and hulks paying equal tolls, suggesting already a classification system that merchants and officials applied to the floating shapes they encountered on northern waterways. The hulk or hulk was a relatively broad and flat-bottomed ship type with a shallow keel, designed for the estuaries and river mouths where deeper vessels could not safely ground. In 1295, hulks of about 50-60 lasts, carrying 100 to 120 tons capacity, were smaller than cogs, though this hierarchy would not persist. By the 14th century, hulks grew to match cogs in size, their hulls expanding to meet the same commercial demands that had built the cog's reputation for reliable cargo capacity. In the 15th century, hulks reached capacities up to 350 tons, their holds yawning cavernous beneath decks that had grown broad and steady. The evolution of Hanseatic shipbuilding traced itself in these expanding dimensions, in the gradual migration of techniques from one vessel type to another. 15th century hulks combined cog keel with broader, rounder hull of traditional hulk, producing a hybrid that drew strength from both parent designs. Planking was clinker-built on the sides, often carvel-built on the bottom, a structural combination that the shipwrights of the Low Countries had developed through generations of experimentation with local timber and distant cargoes. Fore and aft castles were continuously planked up from the hull, creating defensive positions that rose organic from the vessel's own lines rather than appearing as afterthought constructions. Two-masted and three-masted hulks appeared alongside the single-masted basic type, their additional canvas allowing navigation in lighter winds and more precise maneuvering in crowded harbors. By the 15th century, the hulk replaced the cog as warship with its reinforced forecastles and protected mast top, though both types continue to serve the peaceful commerce that remained the Hanse's primary purpose. You are standing now in the Bruges harbour, where a hulk of 200 tons capacity demonstrates this evolution, its broader hull settling into the mud of low tide with the stability that its shallow keel permits. The cold air moves across your face once more, carrying now the mixed voices of stevedores chanting in Flemish and Low German, their languages mingling at the quayside in the rhythmic calls that coordinate the heave of ropes and the swing of cargo. The same vessel from Lübeck, its hold now carrying the wealth of the Baltic, has arrived in Bruges 6 weeks after departing the Novgorod wharf. You observe how the German merchants move among the unloading, their heavy cloaks marking them as men of the Hansa, their fingers counting and recounting the bolts of wax, the bundles of fur, the measured lengths of timber. The cog from Lübeck has fulfilled its purpose once again, bridging the distance between the Gulf of Finland and the Zwin estuary with the regularity that centuries of practice have established. The musty smell of Russian squirrel furs packed in waxed cloth intensifies as a bundle splits its binding and the stevedore pauses to ready it. You feel the cold of Baltic amber in your palm, the irregular shape of this fossil resin warming gradually against your skin, then traded by weight on portable scales that the amber merchants carry in leather cases. The scales balance with delicate precision, the brass pans swinging until equilibrium finds itself in the measured placement of small weights. Amber from the Samland coast, gathered after winter storms on beaches where it has lain since forests sank beneath the sea uncounted ages past, passes from hand to hand with the gravity that attends all materials of recognized value. Flemish broadcloth, measured in standardized bolts, awaits examination by German merchants for quality in a nearby warehouse. You are standing at the entrance to this timber-framed building, where the visual texture of Flemish broadcloth, its nap still raised from fulling, can be examined by lamplight. The fuller's earth and the teasel heads have done their work on the woven wool, creating a surface that catches light and releases it with subtle variation. The quality of the finish speaking to the skill of the Flemish craftsmen and the capital invested in their workshops. Around you, merchants unload cargoes of judgment, their fingers spread across the cloth to test the evenness of the weave, their eyes seeking the imperfections that would reduce a bolt's market value in the eastern markets where it will travel. The return cargo waits in adjacent bays. English wool from London Kontor connections, the raw material that makes this whole exchange possible, arriving in bales that smell of the Cotswold Hills and the sheep that have grown their fleeces through the English winter. Flemish cloth for eastern markets, the finished product of those same wools, returns in the cog from Lübeck to find purchasers in Novgorod and the other trading posts of the Baltic littoral. The cycle completes itself, the cog and its evolving cousin the hulk serving as the mechanical heart that pumps this circulation through the vessels of Hanseatic commerce. The creak of oak hulls working against their caulking as tides rise and fall in the Zwin provides a continuous undertone to all this activity, a reminder that the harbour itself is alive with movement even when human labour pauses. You notice how the water changes colour with the turning tide, brown with suspended mud as it ebbs, greening toward deeper channels where the flow runs clearer. The cold air moves across your face with a faint shift in direction, bringing now the smell of the sea proper, the open North Sea beyond the Zwin's protective banks, where the cog from Lübeck has already passed, and where the hulk of 200 tons capacity will venture when its loading completes. You might consider how the knowledge embedded in that seal of Hulkesmouth has travelled through 2 centuries to inform the vessel you observe now in Bruges harbour. The hulk or hulk, that relatively broad and flat-bottomed ship type with a shallow keel, has proven its adaptability across these centuries, growing from the modest capacities of its first recorded appearances to match, and then exceed the cog that once dominated northern trade. In 1295, hulks of about 50-60 lasts, their 100 to 120 tons capacity smaller than cogs, would have seemed minor participants in the maritime economy. The synthesis of cog keel with broader, rounder hull of traditional hulk-produced vessels that drew admirers from beyond the Hanse's own territories. The cog from Lübeck, equipped for war against pirates during military conflicts of Hanseatic cities, though presently engaged in trade, rests now at the wharf with its single mast and square sail furled against the possibility of weather. The crow's nest lookout awaits the next watchman, who will ascend to scan the horizon for the sail shapes that might indicate threat or opportunity. The cog possessed an aft castle, and by the mid-14th century, often a forecastle as well, these elevated platforms serving in peaceful times as vantage points for the observation of harbour traffic and the identification of arriving vessels. You are standing at the harbour as the light has strengthened enough to reveal the details of hull and rigging, the texture of tarred rope, the particular patina that salt, air, and northern sun impress upon all exposed surfaces. Around you, merchants unload their cargoes with the methodical efficiency that long practice has made automatic, their movements choreographed by the weights they handle and the spaces they must navigate between stacked goods and waiting carts. The cold air moves across your face with a freshness that suggests the day's full warmth remains hours distant, the spring morning still carrying the memory of winter in its deeper currents. The same vessel from Lübeck has discharged its northern cargo and will soon receive the return freight that completes the commercial cycle. The visual texture of Flemish broadcloth, its nap still raised from fulling, examined by lamplight in the counting house, receives the careful attention of German merchants who must justify their purchases to distant principals. The sound of stevedores chanting in Flemish and Low German, their languages mixing at the quayside, rises and falls with the rhythm of their labour, the foreign words becoming familiar through repetition until they form a kind of harbour speech comprehensible to all who work here regularly. The cold of Baltic amber, warmed in the hand, then traded by weight on portable scales, represents the most concentrated value that the northern trade offers, each piece carrying within it the trapped light of ancient forests and the patient labour of collectors who walk the winter beaches after storms. The creak of oak hulls working against their caulking continues its unhurried conversation with the wooden structures that restrain and direct it. You observe how the hulk of 200 tons capacity settles into the harbour mud with an ease that its shallow keel permits, its broader hull spreading the vessel's weight across a greater surface than the cog's deeper draft would allow. The evolution of Hanseatic shipbuilding manifests in this practical demonstration, the hybrid vessel drawing on the accumulated wisdom of generations to solve the perennial problem of moving goods across water. The continuity between that seal of Hulkesmouth and the vessel before you testifies to the persistence of useful forms. Around 1,000, English toll lists established equivalencies that recognized functional similarity beneath superficial difference. The hulk or hulk has demonstrated its capacity for development across the centuries of Hanseatic dominance, growing from the modest capacities of its first recorded appearances to match and then exceed the cog that once dominated northern trade. The synthesis of cog keel with broader, rounder hull achieved what neither parent form could accomplish alone. The cog from Lübeck rests now in the harbour where it has discharged its Baltic cargo. The same vessel from Lübeck has participated in the exchange that brings English wool from London Kontor connections to the looms of Flanders, that sends Flemish cloth for eastern markets to the warehouses of Novgorod. The cycle turns, the tides rise and fall, and the creak of oak hulls working against their caulking provides the continuous accompaniment to human purpose. You are standing at the harbour as the morning advances, the light strengthening across the water and revealing the full complexity of the scene before you. Around you, merchants unload their cargoes with a rhythm that will continue until the holds are empty and the return loading can begin. The cold air moves across your face with a gentleness that suggests the day's eventual warming, the spring sun climbing higher through a sky that has cleared to the pale blue of northern maritime climates. The cog from Lübeck waits peaceful now, its single mast and square sail a familiar silhouette against the sky, its crow's nest lookout empty of watchers, its aft castle and its forecastle standing silent above the deck where stevedores pass with their burdens. The hulk of 200 tons capacity rests nearby with the stability that its broad hull and shallow keel provide. The sound of stevedores chanting in Flemish and Low German continues its unhurried rhythm, the foreign syllables becoming through long exposure as familiar as the creak of oak hulls working against their caulking. You feel the weight of history in this harbour, the accumulation of centuries of practice that have made these movements automatic, these exchanges predictable, these voyages repeatable across the generations of sailors and merchants who have passed through. The cog from Lübeck will sail again when the loading completes, its hold filled with the return cargo that completes the exchange. The relationship between these vessel types continues to evolve in the vessels that surround you. The hulk or hulk has grown into forms that its medieval namers would scarcely recognize, yet the essential characteristics persist in the vessel that rests before you. Two-masted and three-masted hulks appeared alongside the single-masted basic type, their additional sails extending capability and season. You are standing at the harbour as the day establishes itself, the commerce of the Hansa flowing around you in its established channels, the cog from Lübeck and the hulk of 200 tons capacity resting side by side as evidence of the technological continuity that serves this commerce, the past and present of northern shipbuilding displayed in their practical forms. The same vessel from Lübeck will depart when the tides and winds permit, its single mast and square sail drawing it back through the Danish straits toward the waters that have shaped its design. The evolution of Hanseatic shipbuilding continues in the vessels that surround you, the cog giving way to the hulk as the hulk gave way to forms not yet imagined. The creak of oak hulls working against their caulking provides the continuous undertone, the pulse of wooden vessels responding to water and time. You are standing at the harbour, and the harbour stands around you, and the commerce of centuries flows through this place with the persistence of tides themselves. The same vessel from Lübeck departing and arriving, the same exchange of Baltic wax and fur for Flemish cloth and English wool, the same cold air moving across your face with the freshness of the northern sea. The harbour at Bruges in the spring of 1356 carries a particular tension that you can feel in the wooden planks beneath your boots, a vibration of commerce interrupted, of negotiations stalled beyond the patience of aldermen. You are standing near the German warehouses where the cogs of Lübeck and Hamburg have lain idle for 3 days, their sails furled, their holds still half full of Baltic goods that no hand has moved to unload. Around you, the Flemish dock workers gather in clusters, speaking in low voices about the German refusal, about the city council's demand for new harbour dues that would treat Hanseatic merchants no differently than English traders or Italian bankers. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the smell of river mud and the distant smoke of the cloth-dyeing vats, and you understand that something fundamental has shifted in the relationship between this city and its oldest trading partners. The Hanseatic Kontor's special jurisdiction was regularly contested by Bruges city authorities, and this contest had reached its latest crisis in the council chamber of the Steen. where the German alderman had refused the new dues on principle. The alderman, representing the collective will of merchants from Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, and the other Hanseatic cities, had spoken with the quiet firmness of a man who knows that his position rests upon centuries of negotiated privilege, upon the right of German merchants to govern their own affairs in foreign ports, to adjudicate disputes among themselves according to their own laws, to exist in Bruges as something more than subjects of Flemish taxation. The city council had listened, had deliberated, had returned with their demand unchanged, and now the harbour waits in the peculiar stillness that precedes either resolution or rupture. The tension in the Kontor Hall during the alderman's report on failed negotiations is something you can almost taste, a dryness in the throat of every merchant assembled on the long benches, a constriction in the chest as the implications of the alderman's words settle into understanding. You are inside the Kontor now, in the great meeting room where the light falls through leaded windows in thick shafts that illuminate dust motes, and the grave faces of men who have committed their fortunes to collective action. The alderman stands at the head of the room, his voice low and measured, describing the council's final position, the ultimatum delivered, the choice now before the assembled merchants. Around you, the other Germans listen with the particular concentration of men calculating losses, weighing the cost of defiance against the cost of submission, measuring the strength of their collective bond against the certainty of individual ruin. The Hanseatic Kontor periodically threatened collective withdrawal from Bruges to enforce privileges, and that threat, long held in reserve, now hung in the air of this room like the smoke from the oil lamps, visible and unavoidable. The collective withdrawal to Dordrecht. Cogs are loaded, warehouses locked, apprentices sent home. You are walking through the German quarter in the grey light of early morning, watching the methodical dismantlement of a commercial presence that had seemed as permanent as the stone of the cloth hall itself. Around you, the merchants of Lübeck and Hamburg move with the deliberate efficiency of men performing a rehearsed ritual, supervising the loading of their goods onto the broad-beamed cogs that will carry them to the rival port of Dordrecht, where the Count of Holland had offered more favourable terms. The hollow sound of warehouse doors being barred for the threatened departure echoes through the narrow streets, each bar falling into its bracket with the finality of a judgment, each lock turning with the soft scrape of metal that means exclusion, absence, the suspension of ordinary life. In 1356, the Kontor did withdraw to Dordrecht for 2 years in a dispute over tolls, and you are witnessing the first hours of that withdrawal, the physical translation of diplomatic conflict into the language of closed doors and empty keys. The Flemish guilds resented German competition in local markets, especially in bulk goods, and their resentment found expression in the faces of the Bruges artisans who watched the German departure from doorways and upper windows, some with satisfaction, some with the uneasy awareness that their own prosperity depended in part upon the commerce now departing. The city of Bruges benefited from German trade, but sought to regulate it for maximum local advantage, and this regulation had finally exceeded the limits of German tolerance. You are standing at the harbour as the last cog prepares to cast off, its sail already loosened from the yard, its crew moving along the deck with the practiced economy of men who have performed this departure 100 times before, though never in circumstances quite like these. The cold air moves across your face with the freshness of the northern sea, carrying away the familiar smells of the harbour, replacing them with the anticipation of unfamiliar waters, of Dordrecht's different currents, of 2 years in exile from the commercial relationships that had defined German prosperity in the Low Countries. The return after negotiation. New terms are sworn to, old grievances formally forgiven. 2 years have passed, and you are standing once more at the Bruges harbour, though the harbour itself seems subtly changed. The warehouses weathered by 2 winters of emptiness, the wooden piers softened by 2 seasons of unmaintained exposure to tide and worm. The cogs of the Hanseatic cities are returning now, their sails full of the wind that has carried them from Dordrecht, their holds packed with the accumulated goods of 2 years of redirected trade. Around you, the German merchants disembark with expressions of careful neutrality, faces schooled to conceal the relief that must surely accompany this restoration, this formal reconciliation with the city that had driven them away. The relief in German voices when return is agreed, the first beer broken out in celebration, reaches you from the Kontor Hall where the alderman has received the sworn confirmation of renewed privileges, the formal document that restores what had been suspended, but can never quite restore what had been broken. The privileges of the Kontor were periodically renewed through negotiation, never permanently guaranteed, and this renewal in 1358 carries within it the memory of its own precariousness, the knowledge that what negotiation grants, negotiation may also withhold. You are inside the cloth hall as the first German merchants resume their places at the trading benches, their fingers moving across the familiar textures of English wool and Flemish broadcloth, with the tactile memory of men returning to a craft interrupted but not forgotten. The Burgundian dukes, who acquired Flanders in 1384, were generally more favourable to Hanseatic privileges, but that favourable acquisition lies still 26 years in the future, and for now the German merchants must deal with the Flemish City Council that had tested their collective resolve and found it sufficient to force compromise. The political changes in the Hanseatic home cities affected the Kontor's negotiating position in Bruges, and the unity displayed in this withdrawal, the collective discipline maintained for 2 years, would strengthen the alderman's hand in negotiations to come, would demonstrate to Bruges and to the world that the Hanseatic League could enforce its threats, could absorb the costs of collective action, could speak with a single voice when its essential interests were challenged. A violent dispute at the cloth hall between a Lübeck merchant and a Flemish weaver's agent shatters the fragile peace of the restored trading relationship. You are present in the great hall when the argument erupts, when words of commercial insult escalate beyond the conventions of controlled antagonism that normally governed relations between German and Flemish traders. The Lübeck merchant, a man named Gerhard von Wendorf, whose family had traded in Bruges for 3 generations, had refused to accept a consignment of cloth that he judged inferior to the sample originally shown, had rejected the weaver's agent's offer of partial compensation, had spoken with the particular contempt that German merchants sometimes allowed themselves when dealing with Flemish intermediaries whom they considered less honourable than their own established codes. The Flemish weaver's agent, a member of the powerful cloth guilds that resented German intrusion into what they considered properly local commerce, responded with accusations of bad faith, of deliberate sabotage of Flemish industry, of the habitual arrogance of foreigners who profited from Bruges' hospitality while despising Bruges' craftsmen. The metallic taste of fear in a merchant's mouth during a street confrontation with armed guildsmen is something you experience as the dispute spills from the cloth hall into the narrow streets outside, as the weaver's agent summons his fellows from the nearby guild house, as Gerhard von Wendorf finds himself surrounded by men whose faces carry the accumulated resentment of years of German competition, of privileges that seem to place foreign merchants above local law. You are pressed against the wall of a warehouse, watching the confrontation unfold, watching the German merchant's face pale with the realization that his accustomed protections, the jurisdiction of the Kontor, the formal treaties between city and league, mean nothing in the face of immediate physical threat. The Kontor maintained armed guards and occasionally ships for protection against piracy, but these guards were not present in the Cloth Hall, had not anticipated violence in the heart of the city's commercial institutions, and now Gerhard von Wendorp stands alone against the anger of men who see in him the embodiment of all they resent about the foreign presence in their city. Disputes between individual German merchants were adjudicated internally. Conflicts with locals went to mixed courts, but this dispute has bypassed all formal mechanisms, has become instead a test of strength in the street, a moment when the underlying violence of commercial rivalry breaks through the civilized conventions that normally contain it. You watch as the German merchant's hand moves toward the dagger at his belt, as the guildsmen tighten their circle, as the confrontation teeters on the edge of bloodshed that would have consequences far beyond the fate of one disputed consignment of cloth. The intervention that prevents violence comes not from the Kontor guards, who arrive too late, but from a passing alderman of Bruges, a man of sufficient authority and sufficient commercial interest in continued German trade to command the guildsmen's attention, to remind them of the penalties for assaulting a privileged merchant, to restore the situation to the realm of negotiation and legal process. The English merchants, organized in the staple, were rival competitors for wool and cloth markets, and they watched the German-Flemish confrontation with the particular attention of men who might benefit from any weakening of Hanseatic position. You are observing from the corner of the Cloth Hall where the English traders have established their own modest presence, their wool staplers in their distinctive livery, their faces carefully blank as they witness the disruption of their principal competitors' operations. The English staple, centered on Calais and its regulated wool trade, represented a different model of commercial organization, more directly tied to royal policy and national interest than the decentralized collective bargaining of the Hanseatic cities, and the English merchants in Bruges operated with a freedom from collective constraint that the Germans sometimes envied and sometimes despised. Around you, the English voices murmur calculations of advantage, speculations about whether this incident might force a new German withdrawal, might open space in the Bruges market for English cloth and wool that had previously been dominated by German intermediaries. Italian banking houses offered superior credit instruments, challenging Hanseatic cash-based trade, and their representatives in Bruges also followed the unfolding crisis with professional attention. You are standing near the offices of the Bardi or the Peruzzi, though in this decade of the mid-14th century, the great Italian houses were themselves approaching the financial catastrophes that would reshape European banking, their sophisticated instruments of credit and exchange not yet fully discredited by the defaults of kings and the disruptions of plague. The Italian bankers moved in different circles from the German merchants, dealt in different currencies of commercial relationship, offered letters of credit and bills of exchange that the Hanseatic traders, with their preference for tangible goods and immediate settlement, had never fully adopted. The cold air moves across your face as you consider the different commercial civilizations that converged in this Flemish city, the cash-based solidarity of the German Kontor, the credit-based individualism of the Italian banks, the royal monopolized wool trade of the English staple, each with its strengths, each with its vulnerabilities, each watching the others for signs of weakness that might be exploited. Wars between England and France disrupted the cloth trade and threatened German shipping routes, and the broader European conflict that would be remembered as the 100 Years' War provided the unstable background against which these commercial rivalries played out. You are in the Kontor Hall as the alderman reports on the latest news from the Channel. where French privateers and English pirates alike preyed upon the neutral shipping that carried German goods between Baltic and North Sea. The Kontor's collective power depended on the continued unity of Hanseatic cities, which was never absolute, and this unity was tested not only by the Bruges City Council's demands, but by the divergent interests of the home cities, by Lübeck's primacy that Hamburg sometimes resented, by the smaller cities' dependence upon the larger one's protection, by the eternal tension between collective solidarity and individual advantage that defined the Hanseatic League's ambiguous nature as a commercial organization without full political incorporation. The Duke of Burgundy's intervention, confirming ancient privileges in exchange for a loan, belongs to a later chapter of this relationship, to the year 1384, when Philip the Bold acquired Flanders through marriage and inheritance, bringing the prosperous county under the rule of a dynasty that understood the value of commercial privilege in ways that the Flemish City Council had sometimes failed to appreciate. You are present at the Burgundian court, in the particular quality of Burgundian court ceremonial, its splendor masking calculations of debt and credit, as the Duke receives the German alderman with the formal hospitality that signals political intention. The hall in which you stand has been decorated with the tapestries and gold plate that demonstrate Burgundian wealth. The musicians play from the gallery with the precision of rehearsed performance. The courtiers arrange themselves in hierarchies of proximity to the ducal presence that encode degrees of favor and expectation. The Duke of Burgundy, who acquired Flanders in 1384, was generally more favorable to Hanseatic privileges than the Flemish urban patriciate had been, and this favor had its price in the loan that the German merchants would extend, in the financial support that would bind Hanseatic credit to Burgundian ambition. You watch as the alderman presents his request for confirmation of ancient privileges, as the Duke listens with the patient attention of a man who has already decided his response, as the negotiation proceeds through the elaborate choreography of courtly exchange, each statement wrapped in layers of compliment and conditional commitment, each concession balanced by its corresponding demand. The cold air moves across your face from the high windows of the ducal hall, carrying the scent of the gardens below, the distant sounds of the city that depends upon this commerce for its prosperity, that resents and requires the German presence in equal measure. The confirmation of privileges that emerges from this negotiation is sworn to with the formal oaths that bind men of honor, the ancient rights of the Kontor restored and extended, the jurisdiction of the German alderman recognized with a clarity that the Flemish City Council had sometimes obscured. You are present at the ceremony of confirmation, in the church where the oaths are sworn upon relics and gospels, where the German merchants kneel beside Burgundian officials in the temporary equality of sacred commitment, where the secular calculations of debt and credit are momentarily suspended in the language of eternal obligation and divine witness. Around you, the voices of the participants carry the particular resonance of performed sincerity, the alderman speaking his oath with the gravity of a man who knows that its value depends upon the power that stands behind it, the Duke responding with the magnanimity of a ruler who has purchased loyalty at a price he considers favorable. The return to Bruges after this confirmation carries a different quality from the return from Dordrecht 3 decades earlier, a greater confidence in the durability of the arrangement, a recognition that the Burgundian state offers protections that the Flemish city could not provide. You are walking through the German quarter as the merchants resume their accustomed places, as the warehouses open once more to the Baltic goods that have continued to flow through the Hanseatic network, as the apprentices return from their interrupted training in the home cities to complete their education in the commerce of Bruges. The privileges confirmed by the Duke are not permanent, can never be permanent in a world where political authority shifts and commercial interests conflict, but they represent a stabilization, a moment of clarity in the long history of German-Flemish negotiation. You are standing at the harbour as a cog from Lübeck makes its final approach, its sail marked with the city's distinctive colours, its captain visible at the rail scanning the familiar landmarks of a port where his grandfather had traded and his grandchildren would trade after him. The Flemish rulers had sought to tax German merchants equally with other foreign traders, and this equalization had been resisted, had been the occasion for withdrawal and return, for the demonstration of collective power that made unequal treatment preferable to the disruption that German absence would cause. You are in the counting house of a Hamburg merchant as he calculates the costs of this privileged inequality, the payments to the Kontor that maintain its collective institutions, the contributions to the armed guards and occasional ships that protect against piracy, the fees of negotiation and confirmation that attach to every renewal of ancient rights. The merchant's fingers move across the abacus with the practiced speed of long habit, his voice murmuring the figures that translate political privilege into commercial arithmetic, that measure the cost of Hanseatic solidarity against its demonstrated benefits. You are walking along the quay in the evening light, watching the last cargoes being secured for the night, the German and Flemish workers moving together with the temporary coordination of men who share immediate tasks despite their deeper antagonisms. You are in the meeting hall as the alderman reports on the latest difficulties with Hamburg, with the smaller cities that chafe at Lübeck's dominance, with the eternal problem of maintaining discipline among merchants whose individual interests sometimes conflict with collective policy. The tension in the Kontor Hall during these internal deliberations differs in quality from the tension of failed negotiations with Bruges, carries more of exhaustion, of the weariness that comes from managing the permanent difficulty of collective governance. But it is tension nonetheless, the permanent undertone of an organization that has chosen solidarity as its method and must pay the perpetual costs of maintaining that choice. The English merchants, organized in the staple, continued their rivalry, adapting to the changing circumstances of war and peace, of Burgundian acquisition and its eventual consequences, of the shifts in English wool policy that would transform the cloth trade in generations to come. You are observing from the margins of the market as English and German traders compete for the same Flemish buyers, as their different commercial methods, their different relationships to political authority, produce different advantages and disadvantages in particular transactions. The Italian banking houses offered superior credit instruments, challenging Hanseatic cash-based trade, and their challenge too continued, evolved, took new forms as the great medieval banks gave way to new financial institutions, as the techniques of credit and exchange spread beyond their Italian origins to become general European practice. You are on the deck of a Hanseatic cog as it beats against a contrary wind in the narrow seas, the captain's eyes scanning the horizon for the sails that might mean English privateer or French pirate, the armed guards standing ready with the weapons that represent the Kontor's imperfect protection against dangers that no amount of preparation could fully eliminate. The wooden deck moves beneath your feet with the particular rhythm of a vessel laboring against wind and current. The sails crack overhead with the sound of constrained power, and you understand that this passage, this perpetual movement between Baltic and North Sea, between German home city and Flemish commercial entrepot, is the fundamental reality of which the political negotiations, the jurisdictional disputes, the ceremonial confirmations are merely the superstructure, the necessary but secondary arrangements that frame the essential physical experience of trade. You are present at one such renewal late in the century, after the Duke of Burgundy's initial confirmation, as the aldermen and the city council meet once more to swear oaths, to exchange documents, to forgive old grievances and acknowledge new realities. The ceremony has the quality of repetition with variation, the same forms observed, the same phrases spoken, but with the accumulated weight of intervening years, with the memory of withdrawals and returns, of confrontations and compromises, of the long, slow evolution of a relationship that has survived its tensions, because both parties have found the costs of rupture greater than the costs of continued connection. You are standing in the Kontor courtyard as evening falls, listening to the conversations of merchants who have inherited this history, who speak of Dordrecht as their fathers spoke of it, as a place of temporary refuge and permanent lesson, a demonstration of what collective action could achieve and what it could not. Around you, the buildings of the German quarter settle into the particular silence of a commercial community at rest. The day's transactions concluded, the night's accounts pending, the perpetual cycle of commerce preparing to renew itself with the coming dawn. The particular quality of Burgundian court ceremonial, its splendor masking calculations of debt and credit, has become part of the Kontor's experience, part of the political repertoire that the alderman must command, the formal language in which commercial interest must be expressed when it addresses ducal power. You are in the German merchant's memory of that court, or in the imagination that reconstructs what such presence must have meant, the transformation of the rough trader into the diplomatic actor, the translation of commercial interest into the idiom of princely statecraft. The tapestries and gold plate, the rehearsed music and hierarchies of proximity, all these have become instruments of a negotiation that continues through generations, that adapts its methods to changing circumstances while pursuing its essential purpose, the preservation of German privilege in a Flemish city that both needs and resents the foreign presence upon which its prosperity depends. The slow silting of the Zwin you are standing at the harbour at dawn, the water still black with night, the sky beginning to show its first grey seam above the low dunes of the Zwin estuary. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, or rather they are waiting for the tide to lift their vessels enough that unloading might begin. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the particular salt weight of an estuary where freshwater and seawater have not yet decided their boundaries for the day. A pilot named Jan van der Meer is coiling his lead line, the heavy weight still dripping from its last cast into the channel that leads toward Bruges, the maritime lifeline having grown narrower in his father's time and narrower still in his own. The sucking sound of mud as the lead line brings up samples of the estuary bottom fills the pause between his measurements, a wet smack of sediment against his calloused palm. He holds the tallow-coated weight to the lantern, reading the depth by the mark of the line and the quality of the bottom together, the way his grandfather taught him and his grandfather before. The chart in the harbour master's office records 14 feet at this mark, but Van der Meer's line shows 11, then 10, then 10.5 in the uncertain heave of the swell. The Zwin estuary was the maritime lifeline connecting Bruges to the North Sea, and that lifeline is growing shallow, growing treacherous, growing old in a way that water should not grow old. You are watching from the quay as the pilot makes his notations, the ink stiff in the cold, his breath showing in small clouds that vanish quickly into the larger cloud of the morning. The mud he has brought up smells of the deep estuary, of the centuries of silt that the rivers have carried down from the Flemish plains, of the organic matter that has settled and resettled with each tide. The particular lurch of a grounded ship, sudden and then fixed, the tide receding inexorably, is not yet this morning's event, but Van der Meer has felt it before, has heard the timber groan and the captain curse in languages that blend at the edges, German and Flemish, and the coastal dialects that belong to neither cleanly. A fully loaded hulk grounds on a sandbank, its cargo lighted at expense and delay, and this happens not in the grey of this particular dawn, but in the accumulated dawns of the years, when the Silting grew from inconvenience to crisis. The vessel in question is the St. Barbara of Lübeck, carrying rye and timber and the pressed woolens that the Hanseatic cities have assembled for the Flemish market. Its master has misjudged, or the channel has shifted since his last passage, or the chart has lied in the way that charts lie when the world they describe has changed underneath them. The particular lurch comes at half tide, when the water still seems deep enough, when the ship still seems to float, and then suddenly does not. You are in the water now, or someone very like you, a younger man from the crew who is stripped to his waist despite the cold, the leather boots he has kept on filling slowly with estuary water that chills the blood in his ankles. The cold of wading in estuary water to help free a stranded vessel, the mud between toes in leather boots, is a sensation that spreads upward through the body, a numbness that begins in the feet and claims the legs by slow degrees. The St. Barbara does not move. The tide continues its withdrawal, indifferent to the ropes and the straining backs, indifferent to the calculations being made on the deck above about the cost of delay and the cost of salvage and the cost of doing business in a port that the sea seems to be abandoning. Natural silting processes gradually reduced the Zwin's navigable depth from the late 14th century, and this process continues while the men work, continues while they rest, continues while the merchants in their counting houses add figures and subtract hope. The visual of lighters, small and wallowing, transferring bales from grounded ship to quay, becomes the emblem of the St. Barbara's misfortune and of the larger misfortune that it represents. The small boats come from sloughs, from the port at the Zwin's mouth, which grew increasingly important as Bruges itself became harder to reach. They wallow in the swell, their freeboard minimal, their cargoes precious, their progress slow. The smell of exposed mudflats at low water, rich with decay and the industry of shore birds, rises as the St. Barbara settles into its temporary bed. Gulls and curlews work the revealed surface, their beaks probing for the creatures that the tide has stranded or exposed, their cries sharp against the heavier sound of men working. The mud smells of centuries, of the compressed life of the estuary, of the boundary between water and land that shifts and argues with itself. Larger cogs and hulks required deeper water than the silting Zwin could provide, and the St. Barbara is one such hulk, built for the deeper harbours of the Baltic, constructed in the confidence of a different geography. Goods increasingly had to be transshipped at sloughs by lighter boats for the final journey to Bruges, and the St. Barbara's cargo of rye becomes part of this pattern, this new inefficiency that the merchants must price into their transactions. The bales of pressed woolen pass from hand to hand, from the deck of the stranded ship to the deck of the lighter, from the lighter to the waiting cart at the quay, each transfer adding time and adding cost, and adding the possibility of damage or dispute. This added cost and delay to Hanseatic trade operations accumulated across the trading season, across the trading year, across the decades that merchants measured in their correspondence with growing impatience and growing concern. You are standing in the counting house at Sloughs, the afternoon light falling through windows that need cleaning, the dust motes moving in the angled sun. The annual meeting debates whether to petition Bruges for harbour improvements or seek alternatives, and the men gathered around the long table have the particular tiredness of those who have debated this before, who have petitioned before, who have watched the results of their petitions settle into the mud of the estuary like so many other offerings. The Bruges city authorities were aware of the problem but lacked effective solutions, and this awareness is a kind of weight in the room, a shared knowledge that makes the petitioning feel futile even as it remains necessary. The merchant speaking now is from Hamburg, his voice dry with the road dust of his journey, his German precise in the way of legal documents. He proposes the petition again, the formal request for dredging, for channel maintenance, for the investment that might restore the Zwin to something approaching its former capacity. Attempts to dredge and maintain channels were technically limited and politically fragmented, and this fragmentation is present in the room. The interests of Bruges not quite aligned with the interests of Sluys, the interests of the Hanseatic traders not quite aligned with either, the Duke's revenues from other ports whispering in the background of every calculation. Younger merchants note that Antwerp, on the deeper Scheldt, is already handling more German trade, and this observation falls into the discussion with the weight of a prediction, a reading of the future that the older men resist and the younger men embrace. The Scheldt does not silt in the manner of the Zwin, or silt so slowly that human memory cannot track it, or silt in ways that the engineers of Antwerp have learned to manage with greater success than their Flemish rivals. You're walking the quay at evening now. The tide returned and returned again. The St. Barbara floated free at the next high water and sailed with diminished cargo and diminished profit to its next port. An old pilot recalls his grandfather's time, when the Zwin carried ships of any draft directly to the city, and this recollection comes not in the meeting room, but in the tavern afterward, when the formal business has concluded and the informal business of memory and complaint begins. His voice is thickened with age, and with the drink that age permits, his hands shaking slightly on the wooden cup. The ships of his grandfather's time were not different in their essentials from the ships of the present, not smaller or simpler, but the water beneath them was deeper, the channel more forgiving, the passage from the sea to the city, a matter of routine rather than of anxious calculation. The port of Sluys, at the Zwin's mouth, became increasingly important as Bruges itself became harder to reach, and this importance is visible in the tavern's clientele, the Sluys merchants more numerous than they would have been a generation before, their accents local, their perspectives shaped by the geography of the estuary's mouth rather than its terminus. You are in the water again, or in the memory of water, the cold of wading in estuary water to help free a stranded vessel, the mud between toes in leather boots, preserved in the body's knowledge even when the body no longer performs the labor. The old pilot has felt this cold, has stood in the mud while the tide made its decisions, has understood in his bones what the merchants understand in their ledgers, that the Zwin is changing, that the change is not temporary, that the world of his grandfather is not recoverable by any effort that human will can presently organize. The silting was exacerbated by natural coastal changes and possibly by harbor construction at rival ports, and this possibility hangs in the tavern's smoke, unproven but believed, the suspicion that human agency has accelerated what nature might have accomplished more slowly. The old pilot does not speak of rivalry, does not name the ports that might have diverted the currents or trapped the sand that might otherwise have passed through the Zwin's channel. His grandfather's time is his subject, and the subject of his grandfather's time is depth, is ease, is the absence of the particular anxiety that now accompanies every passage. By the mid-15th century, the Zwin was becoming seriously obstructed for large vessels, and the calendar in the merchant's counting house shows this year, this midpoint of the century, this accumulation of decades, since the first notices of shallows and the first complaints of inconvenience. The process was gradual, measured in decades, not sudden collapse, and this gradualness is a kind of torture, a slow constriction that allows hope to regenerate with each season, each petition, each partial and temporary improvement. Merchants complained in correspondence about rising costs and unreliable access, and their complaints survive in the archives, in the copied letters that passed between Kontor, in the growing consensus that something must be done, and the growing recognition that nothing sufficient was being done. You are standing at the window of the counting house, the visual of lighters, small and wallowing, transferring bales from grounded ship to quay, visible in the middle distance where a large vessel has anchored beyond the channel's reliable depth. The lighters move like insects around a larger creature, their labor endless, their progress imperceptible from this distance, their necessity absolute. Alternative routes through canals were proposed, but required capital and cooperation that proved difficult. And these proposals circulate in the correspondence, in the petitions, in the speculative conversations of those who imagine a geography different from the one that inheritance has delivered. The cold air moves across your face, the same cold that the old pilot felt in his grandfather's time, the same cold that the younger merchants feel as they calculate the advantages of Antwerp, the deeper Scheldt, the more reliable passage. The slow environmental change undermined Bruges' commercial position without any single dramatic moment, and this absence of drama is itself a kind of narrative, a story that unfolds in the margins of other stories, in the rising costs and the shifting routes, and the gradual, inexplicable, undeniable shallowing of the water that had made a city great. You're walking back through streets that grow quieter with the evening, the merchants dispersed to their lodgings, the laborers to their quarters, the city of sloughs settling into its identity as the mouth of a channel that no longer leads reliably to its destination. The Zwin carries less than it carried, carries less reliably, carries with the accompaniment of anxiety and calculation and the slow recognition that the world has changed and will not change back. You are sitting now by the fire's edge, or someone very like you, a merchant from the Hanseatic East who has made this journey many times and will make it fewer times in the future, who has begun to calculate the advantages of other routes, other ports, other arrangements that do not include the Zwin and its diminishing water. The cold air moves across your face from the window that someone has opened to clear the smoke, and with it comes the salt weight of the estuary, the particular atmosphere of a place where land and water maintain their ancient argument. The old pilot's grandfather had known deeper water, and the old pilot had known shallower, and the young merchant by the fire would know shallower still, would perhaps see the day when the Zwin became a creek, a drainage, a memory of passage written in the mud that the gulls still probed, and the tide still covered and uncovered with its ancient, indifferent rhythm. You are in the bed now, or someone very like you, the fire reduced to embers, the sounds of the port subdued to the occasional voice and the eternal water. The letter from Hamburg arrives on a vessel that has already passed Bruges by, the captain having deemed the extra leagues to the Zwin not worth his diminished cargo of furs and timber. You are standing in the upper room of a house on the Wallstraat, morning light falling through leaded glass that has known this hour for 200 years, the dust visible in its slanted columns. Around you, the house stands quieter than houses once stood, the servants fewer, the fires lower. The paper in your hands carries your father's hand, the same hand that wrote to you from Lübeck when you were a boy apprentice to the Bruges Kontor, the same hand that now counsels departure. The words advise your removal to Antwerp, to the navigable Scheldt, to the city where ships of heavier burden may come directly alongside the quays, without the intervention of lighters and the uncertainty of tidal channels. Your father writes of sons of other Hamburg merchants already established there, of the Portuguese factors arriving with spices from the Indian Ocean, of South German bankers from Augsburg and Nuremberg, whose credits moved through Antwerp in quantities that would have astonished the modest circles of his own youth. The letter rests on a table that has supported countless such communications, the wood worn pail where generations of elbows have leaned, the grain darkened where ink has spilled and been imperfectly cleaned. The cold of the room reaches through your woolen sleeves, for coal is dearer now and the braziers fewer than when the Wallstraat Hall rang with the voices of full assembly. The hall itself stands half empty at the quarterly meeting, the acoustics unchanged, but the voices fewer, the echoes returning more quickly to their source for lack of competing sound. You walk there on the appointed morning through streets that have grown familiar as your own hand, past the belfry whose bells still strike the hours, past the canals where the water seems to move more slowly than memory serves, more brown, more burdened with what the tides deposit and cannot carry away. The gabled front of the Kontor building receives you as it received your first arrival as a young man, the stone steps concave from the passage of feet, the door iron-banded, the threshold worn smooth. Inside, the great chamber stretches to its timbered roof, the light falling from high windows onto benches that accommodate fewer occupants than they were built to hold. Many familiar faces are absent, their places taken by empty spaces that the eye learns to read as presence denied. The alderman's voice carries more easily to the far corners than once it did, the timbre of authority undiminished, but the substance of what it addresses grown thin. The matters before the assembly concern the maintenance of privileges that ships sailing past to the Scheldt render increasingly theoretical, the formal rights of the Bruges Kontor becoming increasingly irrelevant as its economic activity declines. You listen to the discussion of wharfage dues that no one now comes to pay, of storage rights in warehouses half vacant, of judicial authority over disputes between merchants who have chosen other venues for their disagreements. The process of relocation extends across much of the 15th century, not a single event, but a gradual dissipation, a slow recognition that what was built over generations may be unbuilt over generations also, the unbuilding less dramatic, but no less final for its deliberation. A particular silence settles between the speeches, the coughs, the shuffling of documents, the silence of a building that has known generations of purposeful activity, now grown uncertain. You observe how the younger merchants cluster near the doors, their attention divided between the proceedings and the anticipation of departure, their minds already occupied with Antwerp, with the navigable Scheldt, with the decisive advantages that geography has conferred upon the rival city. Individual merchants led the way, with the Kontor as institution following rather than directing change, and you perceive in the body before you the lag between perception and adaptation, between the recognition of new conditions and the reorganization of forms to meet them. The traditional cooperative structure of the Hanseatic Kontor proved less adaptable to changing conditions, its very success in Bruges having created the inertia that now impedes response. The smell of dust on unused ledgers reaches you from the clerk's table, the wax seals still holding, but the ink faded where accounts have remained open too long, where debtors have removed themselves beyond the reach of the alderman's summons. The archives contain the record of flourishing, the memory of when the Wallstraat Hall held full assembly monthly, when the German presence in Bruges numbered hundreds of souls, when the trade in Baltic grain and timber and wax and furs passed through this city as through the heart of European commerce. Now the pages turn to entries more sparse, to names repeated with the regularity of absence, to notations of death and departure, and the transfer of business to other hands in other places. You walk from the meeting through streets that bear in their stone the memory of German merchant presence, the names of thoroughfares preserving what buildings have partially lost, the architectural traditions of the Kontor visible in gables and window frames, even where the current occupants have forgotten their origin. The afternoon finds you at the harbour, or what serves now for harbour, the Zwin at low tide stretching mud to the horizon, gulls picking at what the tide leaves, the vessels that remain smaller than those of former years, their masters more patient with delay, more accustomed to the calculations of draft and channel depth. The imperial seal granted in 1486 came when the Bruges Kontor's importance was already diminished, the parchment and wax arriving as confirmation of what no longer required confirmation, as honorific to an institution that had become more honored than active. You imagine the ceremony, the presentation in a hall already half aware of its own transition, the seal affixed to privileges that ships sailing past to the Scheldt had rendered increasingly ceremonial. The document now resides in the chest with others, its language formal, its grants explicit, its practical effect attenuated by the movement of trade that no imperial authority could reverse, no privilege could recall from the channels where it had found more natural flow. The last German alderman in Bruges packs the Kontor's records for transfer or storage, his movements deliberate, his hands knowing the weight of what they handle. You observe him in the upper chamber where the archives have accumulated across 2 centuries, the bundles tied with their original cords, the seals appended, the notations of scribes long dead still legible where light has not faded them. Some documents will follow to Antwerp, where the Hanseatic Kontor in Bruges eventually relocated as trade patterns shifted, where new arrangements await the physical memory of old arrangements. Some will be lost, mislaid in transit, damaged by water or fire, or the simple negligence of men for whom the past weighs less than the present emergency. You watch the alderman's face as he makes the choices that will determine which records survive where, which memory persists in which form. The spaces between documents grow visible as the packing proceeds, the shelves revealing their grain where darkness has protected it. The smell of dust on unused ledgers rises with each disturbance, the handwriting of your own youth already assuming the character of historical record, already becoming the subject of antiquarian interest rather than working consultation. The alderman speaks little, his commentary confined to practical matters, to the disposition of this bundle or that, to the arrangements for cartage, to the uncertain date of his own following departure. His voice carries the accent of Lübeck, the city of his birth, the city that remains though the institution he has served here diminishes around him. The memory of German merchant presence remained in Bruges street names and building traditions, and you walk in the evening through these commemorations, the physical persistence of what the social fabric has begun to forget. The Wallstraat itself, the street of the Welsh or the foreigner or the German, depending on the etymology preferred, still runs its course, still receives the footsteps of those who pass without knowing what feet have passed before. The houses maintain their facades, the step gables, the round arched windows that distinguish the German quarter, their construction speaking of prosperity that outlasts the prosperity that built them, their forms persisting where the functions they served have migrated. The cold of evening settles into the stone, the damp rising from the canals, the light from windows fewer and more scattered than in the maps of your memory. Antwerp's rise was driven by multiple factors: geography, Portuguese spice trade, and South German banking, and you journey there as winter approaches, the roads passable, the inns fewer between the cities than commerce would seem to require. The unfamiliar sounds of the new city reach you before the walls, different dialects, different bells, the deeper water of the Scheldt carrying larger ships, their hulls riding higher for their cargo, their masters more confident of direct approach. You enter through gates that have known German merchants for decades already. The gradual nature of the shift, visible in the established presence of those your father's letter named, in the houses already built, the warehouses already filled, the routines already formed that your arrival will join rather than initiate. The German merchants in Antwerp organized differently, less as closed community than in Bruges, and you perceive this in the arrangements of your first days, in the absence of a single hall where all gather, in the dispersal of residence and business across quarters where other nations intermingle. The old cooperative forms loosened, and you find yourself negotiating relationships that in Bruges were prescribed by membership, determining credit and obligation through individual arrangement rather than corporate guarantee. The unfamiliar sounds of Antwerp include this different rhythm of association, the quieter conversations in smaller rooms, the absence of the great assembly where authority sat visible and collective. You stand at the quay to observe the vessels from Portugal riding at anchor with their cargoes of pepper and cinnamon and cloves, the South German bankers arriving with letters of credit drawn on Augsburg, the factors from Hamburg and Lübeck and Bremen establishing themselves in patterns that your father described and that you now verify with your own eyes. The cold air moves across your face, different in its quality from the cold of Bruges, less laden with the particular estuary damp of the Zwin, more open, more carrying the promise of access that the Silting channel has gradually denied. The gulls here are the same species you observe, the same persistence, the same cry, but the context of their scavenging has changed, the debris of commerce different in its composition, the tide leaving different remnants for their inspection. Some historians see the move as symptom of broader Hanseatic decline, others as geographical rationalization, and you encounter this debate in the conversations of your new acquaintances, the older men lamenting what has been lost in the dispersal, the younger perceiving only the opportunity of concentration where advantage warrants. The London and Novgorod Kontors continued, though the Novgorod Kontor also faced decline, and you receive news of these distant institutions through letters that arrive by different routes, their information delayed, their counsel less applicable to conditions that diverge with each season. You participate in this relocation as you participate in all historical processes, partially aware, partially determined, partially determining by the aggregate of individual choices like your own. By 1500, Antwerp was surpassing Bruges as a leading Netherlandish centre of trade, and you observe this passage of years from your established position in the new city, your business conducted in the new forms, your associations formed in the new patterns. The letter from your father, preserved among your papers, has become a document of transition, its advice vindicated by events, its tone of cautious recommendation now readable as prescience. You receive reports of the Wallstraat Hall from those who still journey to Bruges, who maintain the diminished connection, who attend the meetings that continue from habit, and from the formal persistence of privileges that no imperial seal can render economically significant. The particular silence of a building that has known generations of purposeful activity, now uncertain, reaches you in these reports, translated into the different silence of your Antwerp lodgings, where the unfamiliar sounds of the new city have become familiar, where the deeper water of the Scheldt, carrying larger ships, provides the continuous undertone of mercantile possibility. You walk in the evenings through streets that have grown known as your own hand, past warehouses where the German presence is established, but not concentrated, past the houses of Portuguese and Italian and South German associates, whose cooperation takes forms that the traditional cooperative structure of the Hanseatic Kontor, less adaptable to changing conditions, would have found unfamiliar. The smell of dust on unused ledgers reaches you in memory, the archives partially dispersed, some following to Antwerp, some lost. The documents that survive here bear the marks of their transit, the disturbance of their ordering, the gaps where bundles have been mislaid or have remained in Bruges for reasons of negligence or deliberate retention. The alderman who packed them has himself departed, his final years divided between the cities, his authority gradually assumed by other hands in other arrangements, the institution having followed where individual merchants led the way. You return once, in a spring of your middle years, to verify what persists of the German merchant presence in Bruges street names and building traditions, to observe what time has made of the place of your apprenticeship. The Wallstraat Hall stands, its stone steps more concave, its iron bands more rusted, its threshold more worn. Inside, the particular silence has become the more general silence of reduced function, the space used for storage, for occasional gathering, for purposes that the founders would not have recognized. The echo of fewer footsteps returns more quickly to its source, the voices fewer, the acoustics unchanged, but carrying less and less to fill them. The Zwin at low tide stretches mud to the horizon, gulls picking at what the tide leaves, the channel that once bore the vessels of your youth, now passable only by craft of shallowest draught, the passage to the sea more obstacle than avenue. You stand at the harbour that is no longer harbour, or is harbour only in the diminished sense that current conditions permit, and you calculate, as you have calculated throughout your life, the measure of change, the ratio of persistence to transformation, the beautiful and terrible passage of human arrangements toward their own shallows. The unfamiliar sounds of Antwerp have become your familiar, the different dialects, the different bells, the deeper water of the Scheldt carrying larger ships, and you return there to complete your years, to conduct your business in the forms that have gradually replaced the forms of your apprenticeship, to participate in the German merchant presence that has reorganized itself, less as closed community than in Bruges, more open to the multiple factors that drive Antwerp's rise. The process of relocation extended across much of the 15th century, not a single event, and you have been its witness, its instrument, its subject, the gradual nature of the shift having allowed your own gradual adaptation, your own slow recognition that what was built over generations may be unbuilt over generations also, the unbuilding less dramatic, but no less final for its deliberation. You have lived this relocation in your person, in your movements, in the letters written and received, in the accounts kept and closed, in the associations formed and dissolved and reformed in different configurations. By 1500, Antwerp had clearly surpassed Bruges as the principal Netherlandish centre of Hanseatic trade, and you have observed this passage, participated in this establishment, contributed your own portion to the aggregate of individual choices that constitute historical change. You stand at the quay in your later years, the cold air moving across your face, the unfamiliar sounds now familiar, the different dialects comprehensible, the different bells marking hours that have grown as regular as the hours of Bruges once were. Around you, the new German merchants gather in different arrangements, the old cooperative forms loosened, the association more individual, more dispersed, more adapted to conditions that the traditional structure could not have encompassed. The echo of fewer footsteps in the Wallstraat Hall persists in your memory, the acoustics unchanged, but the voices fewer, the particular silence of a building that has known generations of purposeful activity, now uncertain, having become the more general silence of your own approaching conclusion. The smell of dust on unused ledgers, the wax seals still holding but the ink faded, the archives partially dispersed, some following to Antwerp, some lost. These persist also, sensory anchors to a phase of existence that has completed itself while you yet remain. You carry the memory of German merchant presence in Bruges, the street names and building traditions, this tradition that has found its continuation in transformation, its persistence in change, its identity in the very process of becoming other than it was. The cold of evening settles into the stone of your Antwerp lodgings, the damp rising from the Scheldt, the light from windows more numerous than in the Bruges of your final observation, the city still growing, still accumulating, still drawing to itself the trade that the Silting Zwin has gradually relinquished. The navigable Scheldt gave Antwerp decisive advantages over Silting Bruges, and people have lived the working out of this geography, have made their choices within its constraints, have found their prosperity in its opportunities. The individual merchants led the way, with the Kontor as institution following rather than directing change, and you have been one of these individuals, your father's letter the instrument of your leading, your own example perhaps the instrument of others following. The unfamiliar sounds of Antwerp, now familiar, carry you towards sleep in your late years. The different bells, the different dialects, the deeper water of the Scheldt carrying larger ships, the passage of vessels audible through the window you leave open to the night air. The gulls of the Scheldt cry in the darkness, different in their context from the gulls of the Zwin, the same in their persistence, their scavenging, their patient waiting for what the water will provide. You lie in the darkness, the cold air moving across your face, the memory of mud between toes in leather boots, of wading in estuary water, of the old pilot stories, and the complaints of merchants, and the slow silting that persists in the estuary's own geological memory. All these present to you as the record written in water, and in the absence of water, in depth, and in the measured, inexorable, beautiful and terrible passage toward shallows, and toward whatever lies beyond the shallows, in the deeper water that carries larger ships, in the channels that remain open, in the commerce that continues though its forms change, though its centers shift, though the merchants who conduct it pass and are replaced by others who will know other cities, other arrangements, other silences and other sounds, unfamiliar until they become familiar, distant until they become home, new until they become the only memory that remains, the only ground that holds, the only water that bears what the present requires toward whatever future awaits the patient, the persistent, the merely continuing.